Hey,
Hello.
great to see you. I just got an error on my computer saying that it's not going to record my audio, but I'm recording it on a separate feed, so I think it's good. But
Okay.
never had that before, so I'm just like panicking, going like, "Whoa, whoa. If it doesn't record audio, it's going to be a very, it'd probably be good." So I don't know if you've ever listened to my podcast. So I have ADHD, so I go into these long monologues. So it's always good for a conversation. So I
Right.
need all the help I can get to shut up. So if it's not recording my audio, we have a much more balanced conversation. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. It's at the point in the evening where everything's kind of relaxing, and so I'm a few hours removed from the workday, so I'm sort of kind of
Perfect.
decompressing now.
What,
How
what
about
time is
you?
it there? You 4 hours behind, so 8:20, is that right?
Right about there, yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Oh, great. Yeah, a bit more time to come back from home from work as well, not stuck on the freeway like last time.
Yeah. And we're like
Yeah,
in a different part of the city now, so it's just it's a lot easier to get to.
perfect. It's great. Good stuff. Yeah, man, Atlanta traffic. I've only had to navigate it a few times, and I've never had to drive in it, and I'm thankful. You know, that's about as much as I want to engage with it.
Oh yeah, it is not for the faint of heart. Certainly not.
Yeah, I'll pay that Uber every time. Good stuff. How are you doing for time? I want to be really sensitive to any time constraints you have. Are you pretty good? We'll just see where we
Good.
go.
I'm
I
good, yeah.
have like, I just cannot wait. I'm so excited about this. I love, love, love the stuff you put out. I'm always just fascinated by pretty much everything you have to say. I'm just like, oh, this is really just really challenging, really good stuff, really thought provoking. Yeah, I just love it. And you know, you come from a very different background than me. I'm over in the UK. I've lived in America. You're black. I'm white. You know, I know you've got a crazy story. I mean, I've read through your story. I know you did a series of posts about your story before, and I'm like, Jesus, like this is a person I need to be listening to. This is just a crazy story. And so, yeah, I'm really excited. I don't know if you're up for diving into your story. Maybe from that, we
Absolutely.
can talk about all sorts. I mean, I'd love to talk about decolonizing faith, you know, deconstruction, even decolonizing deconstruction. I mean, it's a super white space. I'm every day for the last kind of 2 years, and it's getting more and more every single day. I'm like, I just want to remove myself from the space. I just am like, I just don't want to be another white guy that was a speaker and you know, I was in that
Mm,
evangelical space, traveling, speaking in churches, whatever, and
sure,
I've
sure.
just become the same deal in deconstruction. I mean, I do my own stuff in research, and I think I'd like to kind of shift into a sit behind the scenes, help do really helpful stuff like create data for people and you know all that
Sure.
stuff. Maybe create you know spaces for people to do. But I just am done talking, man. I like see people like you. I see like some amazing voices out there that you're just not getting the attention you guys should be getting. I mean, you're putting out some amazing stuff, and like it or not, like a huge part of that is going to be race.
Oh
I
yeah.
have zero doubt.
Oh
So
yeah.
I'd love to talk about that as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, I know that you're passionate about that stuff as well, and we can go
Hmm.
all over it. There's no topics that are off bar. If you go, this is a rabbit trail I've thought of, run down it. I'm good. I've got all the time in the world. You can say
Good.
what you like. You can cuss. You can, you know, there's
Okay.
nothing off topic. Well, that's my alarm reminding me that I've got a call with you in 10 minutes because I thought it was on the half hour. And then my Zoom, you know, Zoom sometimes reminds you, it's like, you've got a call in 5 minutes. And I'm like, oh, I better go pee.
Right.
So,
Literally, I ran. I'm like, oh
right.
crap! I have to go get a drink real fast. And
Wonderful. All right. Well, let's get dive in, man. I'm
yeah.
really excited to have you on. Do you want to start just maybe giving people an overview of who you are? I've shared your stuff a fair amount. So I think some of my audience have probably come across some of your posts. I don't know if they've then gone followed you or not. I think I've given you a shout out and told people to go follow you before.
Yeah.
But people don't do what I say, which is probably a good advisable thing in life. But do you want to just give like an overview of who you are and you know maybe a bit of your story? We can kind of take that from wherever you think is a good point to dive off. But maybe through the lens of maybe faith and deconstruction might be a kind of nuanced kind of way to look at it, and we can flesh it out wherever we see fit.
Absolutely. All right. So my name is Benjamin Faye. I come from originally from Philadelphia. I currently live in Atlanta, Georgia. Um, and I was a part of the sort of the evangelical sort of church complex for about 20 years.
Wow.
Um, I got I guess you want to call it, saved in about 2001, 2002 as a teenager. And I think initially it was to kind of go with the crowd.
Okay.
My teenage years were not easy ones. I mean, it makes for better art when you're a musician like I am, so I can't be completely mad at it, but but they were not easy. And I think my adoptive mother, oh yeah, I should point out, I am the biological son of two drug addicts, and I was taken in by one of the nurses who worked at the hospital I was born in. And there's a whole other ball of wax with that too. But yeah. But I think from the perspective of my adoptive mother, it was like, I don't know what to do with him, so I'm going to bring him to church because I'm having a spiritual awakening of my own. And so I kind of just didn't want to be seen as the problem child, so I kind of just did it for like a measure of acceptance, just to kind of feel like, okay, well, there's one redeeming quality, you know. And then years later, it started becoming my own faith, something I really kind of grabbed onto. And I did that for years. I was on tons of worship teams. I was a musical director on a couple of them. And there were things that I saw in those spaces, but I kind of just learned to write off. When you're a Black person in a predominantly white spaces, as was the case for me most of my life, you just learn how to engage and kind of learn to do the jujitsu, the mental stuff, and what to say, when to say it, how to say it, the tone of voice to say it. We call it code switching, but it's basically learning how to speak less ebonically to fit into white spaces. And so there was a lot of that, and there was a lot of very casual racism. I remember somebody once telling me that President Obama, there's a lot of President Obama hatred in the American white church. It's wild. But
yeah, I noticed that. I moved to America the summer of 2008, and I left like in the summer of 2012. So I was there for like the full whack of it. And as someone from the UK who is probably quite liberal compared to most Americans, has probably grown up seeing maybe more, maybe not massively more, but I would say more people of color in power and things like that as a normative thing, still steeped in racism over here, big time. And my upbringing was massively steeped in racism. But it really stood out to me going to America, and they're going like, hey, this Black guy that says he's a Christian is a Muslim. And this Jehovah Witness, no, what was it? This Mormon, who historically we have always called a cult. We don't like Mormons ever, but this guy, this one Mormon, he's definitely the Christian choice over the Black Christian guy and the white Mormon. We're definitely going to go with white Mormon. Mormon is now Christianity. What just happened, right? I mean, so I was like, there is race a thing? Am I a racist? I'm looking around the church. The church I was in had one Black guy. It's like 3,000 people. I'm just like, Jesus Christ. Like, am I?
Yeah.
Are we the problem here? Like, it was a shock to the system.
Oh yeah.
That's I grew up in like rural Scotland where we hadn't seen a Black person before. You know what I mean? Like, it was just no one anywhere in rural Scotland. For a good portion of my life, I was in rural Scotland. So like, and it stood out to me while I was in California.
I can only imagine.
It was a bizarre dynamic.
It's a really weird thing. And we're seeing it now that President Biden is appointed, or is trying to appoint, a Black woman to the Supreme Court. And this is a woman who is Ivy League educated, has been on the bench longer than any of the other justices, and there's always the goalpost moving. It's like, oh, well, maybe now we need. Well, at first it was like, is she educated? And it's like, well, she went to Harvard and Yale, and then it's like, okay, well, now she's a Harvard and Yale person. Now we have too many Harvard Yale people. Like it's always this. It's always the thing. Yeah. It's always reframed.
We're just moving the goalposts as much as possible till we
as much as possible until we just kind of skirt the issue entirely. And so I remember sitting in a car with somebody who was a little bit older and white, and they were like, yeah, Obama never had the Black experience because he went to Harvard. And which is to engender this idea that Blackness equates to less than.
Right.
And it's always been like that. So there was a lot of casual racism. And there was always a lot of surprise when I would show up in these spaces and speak with some modicum of intelligence, because it's like they're not expecting that. They're looking at me and they're expecting me to walk in with like Jordans and speak a certain way and have slang terms and all this stuff. And here I roll in with Converses and a Ramones t-shirt talking about all this other stuff, you know. And so there's a lot of like, that's weird. And it's like,
right.
I like what I like. I'm just a human, but because you have yet to humanize me, this is all new territory for you. So there was a lot of that in the church. And then during that time, I got married, ended up homeless. Whole lot of crazy stuff happened. And I was homeless for about 2 years. And it was because of a clerical error from when I was born. So like there was like something that was misprinted on one of my birth documents. So it kept me from working for 2 years. And so it took a long time to get that sorted out, because the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania takes forever to do everything. And so that was going on. But I was still in church, still serving, you know.
Right.
And it was just, you know,
and people knew you were homeless. Did they know you were homeless in this situation?
Yeah. And I think, and to the credit of one of the churches I went to, there were a lot of people who knew, but number one, never judged us for it. And number two, they would help whenever they could. And so I did have very positive church experiences in some instances. Like it wasn't all a shit show. Yeah. It wasn't until we got to the church after we left that one, that started to happen, where it was this narrative of like, well, you can't work, it's because you're not trying hard enough. And I'm like, there's a literal clerical error that's preventing this from happening. Trust me, I would be working
right
if it were not for that. But immediately it becomes an issue of effort. Immediately, like, I always say like it's the same thing like with mental health. It's like white people get to have disabilities, black people just have excuses. Same thing with employment. White people have, a down month. We just have excuses. We just don't want to work hard enough. There's always the conversation about blackness and welfare, even though statistically for decades it's always been more white people on welfare than black. But it's just, it's always the narrative of less than. Yeah. And that existed within the white space. There were a lot of people who did not believe that the government should be involved, and they wanted to eradicate welfare. They wanted to eradicate social services because they believed that the church should be the ones doing those things. However, nobody ever stepped up and said, hey, here's an idea as to how this should work. Here's how the church can do that. It was like the church should do it and then hands off. Yeah. So we started to experience that. And mind you, I was able to get out of that situation, was able to work, able to get into the nonprofit world, and I was able to serve the people who had been in similar situations than I had been. Began doing more public speaking about it. That led to a lot of different roles and a lot of different jobs. One of which I was the first to do in American history, which was really crazy. I didn't know that. It was like, it's a really weird nuance.
Such a niche, like kind of window or something.
It's really weird. Like we stumbled into the knowledge. It was like, oh wait, this is cool.
That's funny.
But it was this kind of complete reversal of things where it's like, okay, now I'm not homeless guy anymore.
Right.
Now you have to take me as a person. What is that going to look like? And it was up and down. I think people were kind of cool with me. They knew I was on worship team. They knew that kind of thing, but there were very few that actually engaged on a personal level and really tried to go there with me.
Yeah.
And I think, so 2020 was the year when things went kaboom for a lot of people, and it did for us as well. This was around the time that, so within the less than a year, we were hearing stories about Ahmaud Arbery here in Georgia. We heard about George Floyd out in Minnesota. We heard about Breonna Taylor. And these are all 3 Black people who were unarmed and shot and killed by either police or white people who think they are police, in the case of Ahmaud Arbery. Uh, and it really highlighted a lot of things about power dynamics
Right.
in America, where it's like white people, when it comes to Black people, feel like they are inherently deputized citizens, so that they can just kind of go after us whenever. And because everyone was home, everyone was forced to look at what Black people had known had existed for hundreds of years.
Right. Yeah.
Like, it's a generational thing. Like when I was a kid, being taught to always keep my hands to my sides because I don't want to be accused of sexual assault later. Like,
Sure.
like all of that stuff is like in your brain from the time you're 10 years old and younger. Or being told when I was like 12 years old, go to school, get a good job, and don't depend on the government for anything. Straight up. Like that's how you're taught. Or you'll always hear the narrative of you have to work twice as hard to get half of what they've got. All of that's true. So people were starting to see that. And a lot of churches responded. Of course, I now know that a lot of it is vanity, but at the time, a lot of churches were responding. And our church wasn't. Like, they were like noticeably silent.
Yeah.
And a few of our friends who are Black were hitting us up. One of them in particular was like, we should talk to leadership about this. And mind you, my wife and I represented probably by ourselves 20% of the Black community in our church.
Right. Okay.
So there weren't many of us. And so we were like, okay, we should probably say something. So a couple of days go by and we're like, okay, we're waiting for, the Sunday morning church Zoom to see if maybe they address it then. Radio silence. So then we say, okay, our pastor is not the most approachable person in the world. Let's talk to his right-hand person, who happens to be the worship leader and the worship director, who we were really close with at the time, and we can have go to for anything. Before we got to make that call, the pastor calls my wife and says, hey, I'm just hearing about the George Floyd thing. That's how you're for George Floyd.
He's just hearing about it like a week and a half in or something.
Mind you, it is customary for pastors in the white evangelical space to villainize any one of a number of things, including but not limited to social media and media in general. So he was very—
It's very gracious of you.
So it's very common for them to be like, social media is evil. Or, TV is bad and it'll rot your mind. While they reinforce Fox News talking points at the pulpit, like that kind of thing. And so he was one of those cats, still is, from my understanding. Didn't own a TV, that kind of thing. So
I can respect that,
Yeah. Like if it came from a genuine place, I could kind of get it.
No, yeah, absolutely. I'm all for cut that off. Yeah.
But his viewpoint had a very narrow scope.
Sure. Yeah. I don't think it's because Satan's trying to get me through it or anything.
No.
I just think it's just my own capacity to manage it is really poor. Yeah.
It was narrow because it was curated that way, Right. And so like there's a lot of filtering of other information. So he's just hearing about the George Floyd thing. And so in his words, he says, we're not going to address it because—
Wow. So he calls you to tell you we're not going to address this.
Yes.
Which is addressing it, right? He's just addressing it to a very small group of people. He's calling around individually to say, hey, I heard there's this thing about Black people and you're a Black person. And I just want you to let you know that's not something we're going to talk about. I'll see you next Sunday. Like it's addressing it, right? I mean, on some level, it's just really carefully addressing it very specifically.
Oh yeah.
Wow.
It's very like, yeah. And but what got me was his reasoning. So he said basically he didn't want to open up a can of worms. He's like, if we address this, then we're just gonna have to address everything. He says, if we address the Black thing, then we're gonna
you have to deal with shit. It's like, you don't want to see the can of worms we have here. Right?
It's like conflict resolution. What's that? So he was like, if we address that, then we'll have to address the gay thing. And I'm like, the gay thing? And it was when it became clear to me that a lot of pastors like to conflate racism and homophobia
Mm,
as the same thing. And so
that's
it's like
interesting.
if we talk about the rights of Black people, then we'll have to talk about the rights of gay people. And because I see those things inherently as both bad,
Yeah, I mean,
I don't
to
want to
conflate
touch
those, I
it.
mean, knowing how most evangelicals see homosexuality, you would not have many evangelicals say, I see a Black person, a person of color, as inherently worse than me, or, that would be, most of them would be smart enough to not say that.
Yep.
But to conflate those two, knowing that they categorically across the board would say, oh no, but homosexuality is just wrong, evil, I
Yeah.
mean, that's a terrifying link to make.
It is. It is. And the reason that I'll tell you why they won't do it is because they think Black people are violent. Like large cross sections of American history are motivated by the fear of Black violence.
Mm,
So you look at when the Civil War ended in 1865, um, a lot of people, a lot of slave owners in particular, were very scared of
yeah.
Black people having an uprising, which, by the way, they would have the right to do
Oh,
and be
big
well
time,
within.
right? Like,
And so they had to create brigades in order to
yeah.
keep not only keep their slaves because they were controlling all the information, um, but they also wanted to make sure that they didn't get any ideas in their head about trying to have any freedom, A, or B, retaliation. And that's where the Ku Klux
Mm,
Klan comes in. Ku Klux Klan started because of fear of Black retaliation.
yeah.
And even there were slave brigades that were created to catch people who had tried to run away, which is actually the root of modern policing here in America.
Mm,
Um, so
wow.
it's it's um it's a huge topic, and they won't say that, I think, because they don't want the retaliate. They don't want the smoke either. Really, I think it's
Yeah.
really what it is. So they'll be a lot more vocal about their homophobia because they're not expecting retaliation from that community. Um, but
Yeah.
they expect it from us because they think we're violent and animalistic.
Yeah.
Um, so he goes on and he says, we're not going to address it, blah, 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 blah. And my wife just kind of is very honest. And she says, look, like, I should point out before I go to that he said that, you guys can, you can hold like a prayer night for it. You can have like conversations. We want to release you to do that, which is basically, it's a cop out. It's saying, I don't want to deal
Hmm.
with this,
Yeah.
but I'm going to leave the education of white oppression to Black people.
Yeah.
Because after all, it's your job. Like, you're responsible for explaining why I don't want to back you up,
Right.
essentially.
Which
And
sounds in this environment could be a really fun and safe thing to do. Like, I'm
like,
sure you were like, yes, awesome. I can't wait to do that.
well, here's the thing. I saw straight through that.
Mm,
I was like, this is some bullshit. You are trying to wash your hands off of this because you don't want to say how you really feel. And so instead of taking any accountability or responsibility for your emotions or your current actions, you're trying to push this off
yeah.
on us. You are making Black people responsible not only for their own oppression, but for explaining it. And that's more work than we should have to do.
Yeah.
And so I saw straight through that. And I was just, after the phone conversation, I was just done. I was like, nope, 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 nope. My wife was a little bit more forgiving. She was like, you know what? Let's give it some time. Maybe we could try this, blah, 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 blah. And she really had to work with me. Like, it took a little bit of doing that night. And I was
Mm,
like, and eventually I came around. I was like, okay, fine. But the leash is considerably shorter now, but I will try. Not even 45 minutes later, another friend of ours who is Black and was going to the church at the time calls us and says, hey, so I got a call from our pastor, and he says he was basically gaslighting her using our speech.
wow.
My wife had told him we're not safe. And he then proceeded to tell our friend that we said that the space was safe. And he was doing so to basically engender this idea of, well, these Black people over
Yeah.
here are saying it's okay. So you saying it's okay now doesn't hold much water. So in effect, he was tokenizing us
Sure.
as as a way of gaslighting her. And that's when I knew I was done.
Wow.
And a couple of days later, I think we announced that we were leaving to
Wow.
leadership. Um, and we didn't really tell anybody. And a few of our friends began leaving kind of quietly. Um, uh, but of course, it got out. We left group chats, and it's like, wait, what's going
Sure.
on? Um,
And these
and
friends that
then
are leaving, are they mostly people of color as well, black? Or was there a mix? Or were white people involved in this going, yeah, you know what,
initially,
I'm done? Or
initially, it was entirely people of color. So it wasn't just black people. There was a few people from other
sure.
places, but there was like maybe 5 or 6 of us that decided to leave.
Yeah.
Um, and so we got a lot of texts and a lot of, please reconsider. We need your voice. We need this. Blah 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 blah. And I'm like, where was this 2 weeks ago when y'all were silent when this stuff started happening?
Yeah.
Like, y'all all follow me on social media. You know what this meant to me. You know why it was a problem. At this point, I've given you what I thought was biblical reasoning for
Mm.
why you shouldn't just like ignore people. Like,
Yeah.
and it's sad that I even needed that much.
Yeah.
So, like, why now does my voice matter? Or is it just you having to deal with the consequences of your actions and you don't like it?
Mm. And were they
Um,
listening to you mentioned your social media, but like, were they engaging with that? Or, but did you notice people that, were silent on this would have liked your comments on social media and things like that? Or did they know what your position on social media was, i.e. they kind of like turned a blind eye? Because I've noticed there's people in my life at times who have come up to me and gone, I cannot believe that you're suddenly like this. And I'm like, dude, I've been like this for like 8 years on Instagram. Where are you at? Like, I thought you followed me. Like, and some people just seem shocked, or even they saw it but didn't see it, or like you can kind of do that
yeah,
cognitive dissonance stance, or
yeah.
because you're a vocal man. I mean, I don't know if that's changed a lot since 2020 as well, so I don't know what you were like back then. But you're very articulate, you're very vocal on a lot of things like race, politics, things like that. Like, was that the case back then? Were you speaking about these kind of things?
Yes and no. So I knew how to pick my spots. So I knew that social media, and even within social media, I knew they were watching that. So I had to kind of
Mm,
temper my speech. And I think that's why they were okay with it.
you're
Like,
right.
going back to like the code switching thing, it's like I know how to say what I need to say for the audience that I'm speaking to.
Yes.
And so I knew I was speaking to largely white evangelicals. So there was and not only largely white evangelicals, but people who were people of color who had kind of cozied up to whiteness as a construct.
Right.
So I knew how to speak to those people because I'd spent so much time in that environment. And so it's kind of how Instagram kind of exploded for me, was speaking about that stuff. So I wrote a post about why Ahmad's story matters. I told a story about how one back when my wife and I were still living in Florida, we were walking back to our apartment, and in the middle of the night, a car drives straight by us. And it wasn't uncommon for cars to yell things out, like people yell things at us out car windows. It happened a lot,
Hmm.
particularly on this drag up road. And we're driving by one day, and somebody flicks an open packet of barbecue sauce at my wife. Barbecue sauce is one of the things that is commonly associated with Black people in America,
Sure.
just for some context. It's in that same avenue with like fried chicken and watermelon, and there's all kinds of historical context behind, especially watermelon. Um, but I knew what it meant when they did that,
Mm,
and so they were at a stoplight, and I was enraged, and I said, "You hold on 1 minute." I take off sprinting towards the car because I'm like, that's just not gonna fly with me. And I'm not like a physical like fight person, but it's like, given the right provocation, I can forget about that for 5 minutes. Um, you know, and it takes a lot for me to get there.
mm.
Uh, so I take off running, and my wife yells at me, and she's like, "Wait, wait!" And she runs at me, and she could have said a number of things in that moment. She could have said, "Stop! It's not worth it. Just cool off." she runs to me and grabs me by the arm. She says, "You are a Black man in Florida.
Yeah.
You don't have, essentially, you don't have the luxury of being right here. You could pound them into next week,
Yeah.
and who's looking at charges?" That's just the balance of things. So I told that story, and I'm like, it doesn't. I basically made it plain. It doesn't matter how we dress. It doesn't matter how properly we speak. It doesn't matter how much education we have. We're always seen as second class. We're always seen as expendable. And so I wrote about that, and it just kind of exploded, at least by my definition of what exploded was, because I didn't have a lot of engagement prior to that. But next thing I know, like, my post is being shared all across, like, University of Georgia. People as far away as like Russia were like engaging with the content. Like, I was getting messages about like Black Lives Matter events in Wales. Like, it was like a person from the Netherlands message. Like, it was insane.
Wow.
And it was bigger than just the church community. So the church community saw it and was like, wow, thank you for enlightening us on this. Um, which now I look at a little bit differently, because it's like, it's a different perspective that makes you feel something for 10 minutes and then you forget about it until it comes up again. And then it's like, well, we've already talked about this and I'm tired of talking about it. As if the fatigue of talking about oppression
it can remotely compare to
the fatigue of legitimate oppression, you know. So there was like surface acceptance. So they understood where I was at, and I wasn't the only one who was there. And honestly, if you'd had conversations with me prior to that, you knew where I stood. Like, it's not really hard to figure out. Like, if you didn't know, you could put two and two together. It wasn't that hard. But yeah, so when we left, we removed ourselves, we took ourselves out of group chats, all that stuff started happening. The following Sunday, we find out about our pastor basically saying very surface things that could be interpreted as just very general statements, but we knew they were about us.
Right. The damage control sermon.
Or more so, like, you know, it's not good for the culture if we have if side conversations are happening. It ruins family. And mind you, this is a 250 person church, so it's a small town basically.
Right.
And so it's like, at the time we had a group chat, all the people who left, just to kind of as a support system for each other.
Sure.
And so that's what he was referring to, is the fact that they're talking to each other. Let's go ahead and squash that. And because, in large part, because at least one, if not a few of the people who were involved were still living in the homes with people who went to the church still.
Right.
And so it was like the pastor's way of like saying, you put the kibosh on that. Like, just get rid of that. Forgive me, I don't know if that's a proper statement. Put the kibosh. I want to make sure that that's not like an offensive statement. So someone please let me know if it is, and I will eradicate it from my speech. But they were basically kind of not lay down the law, but sort of. He was like deputizing people. And so I know one friend who had difficulty with that, who was accused of causing disunity by speaking up about that.
Just by having a different narrative, right? At the end of the day, this is all about, I want to control the story behind why people left, why we are this way, why we're right, and why they're wrong. And
100%.
other people talking might allow for other people to think I'm wrong and they're right. It's such a weird, like, I see it with people that leave churches. Usually people in leadership roles are told they have to leave like that. They're told not to communicate with members. And then the leaders talk to the members and say and then it's just this bizarre story. It changes whatever. They sinned, they fell, they whatever, but they have requested that no one meets with them or no one speaks to them, or we're saying no one speaks to them. And it's this thing of like, how do we control this story so that what they're talking about doesn't reflect poorly on us?
Absolutely.
Right.
It's funny. at the time this was happening, I was watching Leah Remini's thing on Scientology,
Yes.
and there's so much connective tissue between the way that churches function when the churches of this kind function when somebody leaves, and the way that the Scientology functions when somebody leaves.
Mm,
Like, the church just doesn't call them suppressive persons. That's really what
right.
it is.
Right.
But there is a similar level of excommunication. It's just a lot more covert.
Yeah.
And so they were being particularly like aggressive towards this one friend. And then also the pastor like covertly taking shots at us in the in sermons, and then spitting this narrative that like we just didn't want to communicate or blah blah blah. Mind you, we did everything the right way. We
Right.
spoke to leadership, we made our feelings known, and when we were not respected, we let it, we said, hey, we're leaving and this is why. We did this by the book.
Mm-hmm.
But any one of a number of narratives got spun, and we know, only reason we know about it is because friends of ours were being told that,
Right.
not realizing that they were talking to us. um, so it was just kind of ridiculous. And so it was really shaky for a while because we didn't even know what we were trying. We just thought we were just going to go to another church after we kind of calmed down. And so but then, you know, it started getting really strange because I started hearing more stories about other churches at the time that were doing similar things and having similar reactions to people who were speaking up about racism. A couple weeks go by and I'm starting to think about this stuff. I get a message in the group chat from somebody who had gone to service that morning at the church we just left. And they said, yo, dude is on the mic screaming all lives matter. And at this point, we were far enough removed to where it could be kind of comical. But I'm like, no way. And so I go and look up the sermon because they had recorded it.
Right.
And dude is just angry and kind of unhinged.
Mm-hmm.
And because I think my theory is that he had only been able to control the narrative but so much.
Yeah.
And so he just kind of just went off. And he was saying a whole lot of things. I think he called us like children of the father of lies and like all kinds of stuff. Just went off about the Bible and was like, he held the Bible up in the screen. It's like, if it doesn't say it here, I don't care about your opinion, and just crazy stuff. And he yells like, all lives matter.
Right.
And so I was telling them, because I was one of the brave souls who actually watched it, and I was like, this is crazy. Like, you guys, like, when you feel okay, you should see it for yourself. Mysteriously, that video went missing about 2 to maybe 3 hours later.
Wow. I'm surprised they had enough self-awareness to bring it in, but probably just repercussions more than anything else, probably.
Right. Somebody was like, yo, we have to get rid of this.
Someone watching the web traffic sees the spike and is like, I don't know if this is a good spike.
And the sad part is because the church is so small, I know most of these people. So I'm just like in the Rolodex of all the people, and I'm like, which one of y'all had the conversation was like,
right.
Because we know it wasn't him. And so we end up having a conversation with, so the church that I went to was a part of a network of churches, both nationally and internationally. And so we spoke to what we jokingly referred to as the mothership, which was like the mother church of all the churches. And we spoke to leaders. And their position was like, this is awful, but we can't do anything about it. Or more so, we won't.
Yeah.
Because I feel like they could say something, but they wouldn't. And basically the way they explained it to us was that, and this is me editorializing this a bit, but the way that Chick-fil-A functions in America is that, and I don't know if you guys have anything adjacent like that over there, but it's independently franchised.
Right.
So you're buying the name and the likeness, but you're running this thing by yourself.
Right.
And that's how they run their churches. Like, you have to fundraise by yourself, you have to get everything set up by yourself, but you have our name, so we actually have no legislative power over you. You just share a name with us. And so they kind of just wash their hands of it.
Wow.
And that was kind of like the thing that was like,
I bet there's a whole bunch of shit. I bet if they started yelling Black Lives Matter from the pulpit, they might have had a problem. But like, I bet there's something that church could have done where they would go, okay, you're not using our name. Right. I mean, let's be honest, right? There's something, right? I don't know if they start going, Hail Satan. I don't know. Like, there's a line somewhere where they would go, oh, actually, yeah, we actually have quite a bit of power, actually. And we're receiving of course, right? They're not going to just let you
like,
these.
I've heard so many stories about these people. Yeah, like I've heard so many stories about people being ripped out of the mission field because of certain decisions they made that weren't upholding the values. And I'm like, so if you can rip somebody out of Siberia, you mean to tell me you can't deal with somebody stateside? Yeah. Now, mind you, I've since heard rumors that they've spun off and become their own thing, but I don't know how true that is because I'm not really connected with anybody at that church. But it kind of I won't say kickstarted, but it really kind of amplified those thoughts in my brain that had kind of always been there of like, what if some of this is bullshit? Like, what if you've been contributing to this thing, but you've been trying to get up this hill to be this good Christian, but what if that construct doesn't exist? What if you've been chasing a ghost, essentially? And so what started my path down deconstruction was simply not having an answer to that question, or at least not a satisfactory one.
And that's a scary question to ask. I mean, like, that's a very destabilizing question, just to have sitting in front of you with no clear answer.
Oh yeah, a very deep depression followed that question. Wow. For months. And because I was like, man, I gave my life to this. I think the common assertion from a lot of people is that people deconstruct because they're not really committed. When you find that if you talk to a deconstructing person and you're in the church, you'll learn more about the Bible than you probably learned in the past 6 months sitting in your church. Right.
And you don't want to know most of what you learn either.
Exactly. Exactly. It's like, have you heard about King James? Like, like those kinds of things are what you're gonna learn. And so I remember like feeling like I was kind of on an island. I don't know anybody who's thinking the way I'm thinking, who's openly asking these questions. And by the way, as a person of color, that's a way more dangerous proposition because of how much Christianity is a part of Black culture.
Yes.
Like if you think about it, the civil rights movement was led by essentially clergy members.
Yeah.
Like a lot of white pastors won't acknowledge it, but Dr. King was a preacher.
Right. Or white pastors will grab onto it and say, look, Christians brought about liberation, and like, right? I mean, it's one way or the other, right? We ignore it or we just co-opt it entirely when we don't actually acknowledge that all the white pastors at the time wanted to kill Martin Luther, right? I mean, let's be honest.
I'm like, we could have a conversation about Jerry Falwell. We could have a conversation about James Dobson, or we could usurp all of that and go back 100 years before that and have a conversation about the Southern Baptist Convention and about how the SBC was founded to protect preachers who were slave owners. Like, it's just, it's all of this history that just kind of gets forgotten about or whitewashed completely. Yeah. But like, and so it's like, I'm having to sit with all of this knowledge of like, okay, the institution that I gave all of this energy and time to was, number one, more racist than I thought it was. And number two, I'm starting to have structural questions about what I stood on for all these years, not to mention the associated guilt with all of that, because there's a lot of morality attached to faithfulness, where it's like, if your faith wavers, then there's something wrong with you and not the theology. It's always a personal thing. Like if there's a problem, you are it. Yeah. Every time.
Yeah. Can I ask a question about that first point before we dive too much into the second point? Because I feel like this is an interesting thing to me. Like, so I've been back in the UK since, or somewhere else other than America, since like 2012. Visited America a lot. I was in America 2020. I was in America when Trump was getting inaugurated, and there were like women's marches. The Black Panthers were marching. I was in like a rural town where the Black Panthers said they were going to march, and alongside the women's march for the day. And the guy I'm staying with that's invited me to his church is going, I don't understand what these Black people want. We gave them the vote like that. He literally says that to me, and I'm just like, what are you wanting me to say to that? Because that's not okay. And I'm driving with him to the church, and on the radio, the mayor of the town is saying if the Black Panthers show up armed, they will have a gunfight. And you're like listening to this, and I'm just sitting here as like good like British person who's like only ever seen a gun like 3 times and left until I got to America. Like I'm like, holy shit, I'm gonna die. So I'm so removed from it all, and so I see it with this lens of like, fuck me, America, Jesus, could you just tone down the crazy? Right, that's my general vibe towards America. On the whole, I love America. It's my favorite place on earth, and it's my least favorite place on earth. And my favorite people live there, and my least favorite people live. It's everything. But people know. I mean, I love America. All my friends know I would go back and live in America if I could. I absolutely adore it. But to me, it's really interesting because, I mean, from an external perspective, watching on, you're looking at things like 82% of the evangelical church voted for Trump.
Yeah.
You're looking at things like racism, even what we're talking about with Obama, racism has been embedded in the political system and the Christian political system for ever. Like, I don't know, as long as you've got America, you've got that to some degree. And so, right. I mean, even the moral majority, it's not even a moral thing. It's a race thing. It was always a race thing right from the get-go. And so there's dynamics there that really fascinate me, in that you were existing in this space, and it feels like just listening to your story and watching as an observer, I'm like, wow, like you were in this space. Like, I can't imagine there was that many people in an evangelical church that weren't pretty damn racist. I'm just in awe. I'm like, you made this, like you fought to make this work. You wanted to be a part of this. You did constantly, change who you were to fit into this world. And yet there's another dynamic as well to me, which is surprising of, it's only really dawning on you how this is a big institutional thing. Like, what was that about? Can you talk about that? Because to me, and it's really easy for me to say, because I'm completely out of the loop. I'm looking at it from different perspective. I'm not you. I've not, we're all different. But I'm like 2020. I'm like, dang, like I'm like 2016. I'm like watching this guy rise to power, and I'm like, Jesus Christ, evangelicals have got some shit to sort out, because this is scary. Like the degree to which we're moving away from like, we're just, we're going to vote for a Mormon now, or we're going to, whatever white old dude that wants to not tax the church is going to get power. Basically, this is where we're at. But it's getting more and more and more scary to me. And Trump was a really scary thing for a lot of Black Americans.
Yep.
And yet I'd imagine your church was predominantly quite supportive of Trump. Would that be safe to say? Or were they not? Like, I'm really intrigued by that dynamic.
So here's what's interesting about it, because there really was a strong anti-Obama sentiment, like I mentioned, but there wasn't like a strong pro-Trump thing. Okay. I remember my wife and I having an issue with something that the pastor said about it one Sunday morning. Where he said, essentially went right, I think this was the Sunday before election Tuesday. He said, vote on values. He's just vote on values.
To say that, right? But these are the values you have to vote on.
Right. And so that was the thing we said, was like, okay, well, whose values? Because it's like, as it is, if you're a person of color in America, you really don't have a lot of choices in front of you when it comes to presidential nominations and such, because racism is pretty nonpartisan.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, I was joking with somebody the other day, like how I wanted Bernie really badly, Bernie Sanders, to be a presidential candidate for the Democrats, even though he's more of an independent, because he's more what you would call progressive.
Right.
Although I imagine our progressive is a lot of other people's middle, but like he's much more progressive.
He was great. I'm yeah. Bernie would have been a great option.
Yeah, but the thing they said in the last election, this last one between Biden and Trump, was that Bernie at 80 something years old, he's too old to run the country. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you two white dudes in their late 70s.
Honestly, that's the amount of problems that Americans would solve not voting for people that would shit themselves every time they sneeze. Like, I just think, like, can we stop voting for geriatric people that, like, I mean, like, literally their parents probably own slaves pretty much at this point. Like, right? I mean, not like, quite, but like they are, you know, we're like, what's their parents' generation? Like, you know, 100+ years ago, potentially.
Right.
Like, so, which I know is, you know, not quite that timeline, but Jesus.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. The last, slave ownership was a thing in Congress into the 1900s. So the last congressperson to own a slave, I think, left Congress in 1922. That's important because 1922, I'm pretty sure, is the year Betty White was born. So there's a lot of cultural overlap where it's like, this isn't actually that long ago.
Yeah.
So there is that tension of, like, they're not like vocally pro-Trump. Like, we didn't see any like MAGA hats or anything like that. If anything, we didn't see any pro-Trump sentiment start to show up until around the time you're about to leave.
Right.
So I think there was like a prayer call that my wife was on, that united a whole bunch of churches in the area.
Right.
And it was basically, from what I understand, because I wasn't on the call, and I'm thankful for that now, because I would have been really angry about it, but it was basically a pro-Trump rally.
Right.
That they called the prayer thing. And it was basically getting people to vote for Trump. And there was a lot of connection between the church I was going to and the local government, because the local government had just elected a Republican who was a Christian. And so that makes things a lot easier for that church to kind of do what they need to do in the way that they want to do it, because they have a sympathetic ear. And, you know, so at that point, we were troubled by it, and we knew that there would probably be a lot of pro-Trump sentiment. And in subsequent conversations, my wife would have conversations with people, one of whom was an immigrant who, or no, he wasn't an immigrant, forgive me. He was, I think he was a first-generation American whose parents were immigrants,
right?
Who said that he was voting for Trump because Trump was the Christian option. So that was something that happened in a subsequent conversation, but subconsciously, when you're a person of color, you walk into rooms that are predominantly white, knowing on some level you cannot expect safety. You're not going to get like physical violence, maybe, but it's not completely off the table. It never is. But there will be microaggressions. There will be these little snide comments. You know, and it's not just in church spaces. I remember when I was going to speak somewhere, I was dressed fairly nicely, and I was speaking about like the issues I'd had with identification and all that stuff, and just talking like very conversationally. And I'd spoken about my homelessness and all that stuff. And I remember an older white lady pulling me aside later on. She was like, "You were so wonderful and you spoke so well." And she goes, "You know, you look like somebody we would help, blah, 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 blah." And I remember it was one of those things that just kind of flies by you. But I remember sitting in the car, right, in my car, and sitting down and turning on the car. And I'm like, what the hell did that mean? And so it's these things where it's like, because you're so used to it, it kind of almost registers in the same way that a McDonald's will register to you if you've been driving through America for 16 hours. You're driving in America. You're going to see many.
You just see one every few miles.
Yeah. Or it's like where I grew up, we had a gas station called Wawa, and it's just everywhere. up there. It's like you can't drive 5 miles in any direction without hitting at least 2. So it's kind of like that's how racism is for us. It's like you can't really go 5 miles in any direction without seeing it. When we were living in Florida, we were in Orlando, which is a really fairly blue part of Florida, which is an objectively red state. Right. Like it has pockets of blue, but it's mostly in urban areas. So like, Jacksonville, Tampa, that kind of thing. But I swear, like I remember my wife and I were going to the beach one day, and you get 15 minutes outside of Orlando, you start seeing the Trump flags. And I remember I saw a Trump 2020 thing that was huge. It was hand painted on wood.
Wow.
Like it's real for people. It's just real.
Like there's a whole level of commitment where I need to paint my house, like my walls are like the paint's peeling and I need to go to a shop, buy paint, get some stuff on the floor, cover some desk or whatever and paint the floor. I'm not doing that shit. I just don't have time, right? I got stuff to do. To get a whole bunch of wood, build a sign and paint it that I like Trump. Like, I mean, I just like, Jesus. As if anyone in America as well, by the way, is sitting there going, Trump or the other guy, I don't know. Right. I mean, I just don't know if anyone in America is sitting there going, I'm not sure. Could be a coin toss. Like,
I mean, you'd be surprised.
Most people got a team or just hate the whole system.
Right. There's a lot of sort of ambivalence and things like that. But you'd be surprised how many Trump supporters there actually are. Like what I tell people is like, don't think because Biden won that this is over. Because be honest,
no, it was close. Jesus Christ, it was really good.
That's
and there's more people voted for Trump than any other president in history, right? I mean, Jesus, apart from Biden, right? But the second most voted for president in life in American history is Trump.
Correct. And that's why I told people it's like he got more votes the second time after he had proven how dangerous he actually is. And more y'all voted for him this time around. And mind you, for people who were like supporting Biden, it was very much a live to fight another day vote because a lot of us were not really supportive of Biden, but we just really didn't want Trump. So it was more of a trying to get this guy out than put this guy in.
Big time.
Vote. But yeah, there is a lot of that around, and you just have to learn to navigate it. And you can always tell, like, there's a vibe that people give off. You can always tell when something isn't safe. You can always tell when an environment isn't quite right. Like we've walked into spaces where we went to get food and we can tell that the person making the food was less than happy to give it to people of color. And this is since moving to Atlanta, by the way. And Atlanta is very blue. It's very progressive. It's very open about its support of the LGBTQIA community. Like it's like more so than Orlando was. And it's kind of supported by local government. Like it's not just a people thing, it's just a totally different vibe here. But even here, you go to the wrong place, even if you're just trying to obtain sustenance, you're going to run into that. So it's not so much that 2020 was the first time that we really experienced it. It was the first time we were forced to look at it for what it was. Like it's no longer registering as background information because I'm now outside of an environment that necessitated that I look at it as background information. Yes. Now I have to stare at it and say, okay, this is what this was. And not only did this oppress me, but I contributed to that oppression because I defended it and was a part of it. Like I went on those mission trips, even me now understanding that mission trips is modern day colonization does nothing to absolve the fact that I went on them.
Sure.
And so it's the confluence of you recognizing what it had done to you and recognizing your own complicity in what it had done to other people.
Yeah.
And so that was a whole ball of wax. It was rough.
Yeah. No, I mean it's astonishing. And I just want to clarify. I wasn't saying there was. Yeah, I was just trying to highlight. I'm fascinated by the Trump supporter that thinks he's going to swing anyone to vote for Trump by his sign. I wasn't saying
no, it was a great question.
People, but
yeah, no, it was a great question.
Yeah, I think there's just this weird dynamic, isn't there? Like I saw this again and again and again. So coming from the UK, we have different things that are important to us when we vote, maybe. So something like abortion is probably quite important to a lot of Christians, for example, to some degree in the UK, but it's not a political thing that you're going to vote for someone and that's going to change. Right. No one is going to change that. Right. That's been pretty set in stone for a very long time, and it is the way it is. And maybe some radical group is going to try and make you vote about it or whatever, but it's not a big thing. So going to America and then realizing, oh, you are willing to vote for Satan if he gets up there and goes, I'm going to make abortion illegal, even though the last 20 people that said they're going to make abortion illegal didn't do that. And even though all the data that says people that make abortion or try and make abortion legal end up having more abortions during their term than people that are not making it legal. All these things. So I'm looking at it going like, so wait, even though all that's going on, you're still going to go, now we're going to vote for anybody, literally anybody, over this one thing. Now it's never about the one thing, right? We keep talking about the moral majority and how it was never about abortion, but
never.
And abortion generally is only about race anyway, as well, to a whole degree as well. But it is fascinating seeing that dynamic, and I guess that's the thing that really fascinates me. And again, I have no idea what it is. I mean, I'm straight, I'm heterosexual, I'm white, I'm from a very, very poor family, but I have now probably got a fairly middle class experience. I have no idea what it is to be in a church that erases my identity, my experience, all these different things over certain quote unquote values that are more important, as though it's more important for us to make sure that someone says they'll stop abortions, not even that they will, over someone says, hey, there's a whole subset of our community, our country that's being completely trodden all over, or hey, there's no education in this country that's particularly good quality for all, or hey, there's no healthcare. People are literally dying or going bankrupt, or dying because they can't afford to pay for healthcare. Huge topics, but it's like, no, we'll silence that. No, we won't talk about racism. No, we won't talk about healthcare. We won't talk about these things. I have no idea. And I guess that was what I was wondering, and you touched on it brilliantly and tackled it. But yeah, just what is it to go from 2016 through 2020 and be in a space? What is it to drive through Florida and see a flag in every single garden, and see huge signs, and see the Trump trucks painted like, I don't even like a Trump truck. Like, I mean, Jesus, that's going to date well. Because every single one, presumably on some level, is a signal of I have aggression towards you. If you get close enough to me, if I am made to have to face you and your existence on some level, I mean, I have no concept of, there's maybe ignorance of one's racism and maybe no intentionality for racism for many Trump supporters. I have no doubt. To some degree, but that doesn't change the fact that if you're, as a Black man in Trump town, I just can't even imagine what it is to go through that and to still try and make it work. Like, we talk about like, oh, they never really cared about Christianity, or they never, like, are you fucking kidding? Like, like, it's like, do you have any idea how hard I'm trying to make this work?
Right.
It just amazes me to hear, like, how hard some people really were invested in their faith and in their communities, and willing to erase part of their identity for that.
Because it's all we had. Like, you get into this space where it they talk a lot, at least the church we were in was a lot about tribe. Like, we are family, we've got, like, everybody lived within the same 3 to 5 mile area. Like, people hung out together. The unmarried single, like the single men, most of them lived in houses with each other. Same thing with the women. It was to keep them accountable. Like, everybody was always together. So we made it work because in our brains, that was all we had. Like, so it's like, it's not like we have another choice. Like, there's only but so much you're going to be able to advocate for yourself within the parameters of that. So we tried to make it work because we thought, like, this is what it meant to be faithful to Jesus. We thought this is what it meant to be serving community, but we never really thought about, at least not in a real tangible way, what it would be like if the community didn't serve you. Like, it was always about what we are doing. You know, don't worry about everything else. What are you doing? So it's like we just have to learn how to get through it, because what else are you gonna do it? You know, and then when you're not crying about it, you laugh about it. Like seeing a whole Trump bus in the middle of downtown Orlando when you're just walking to get Chinese food on break from work. I remember jokingly, I called my wife and I'm like, there's a whole Trump bus down here. I'm like, I want to urinate on it so badly. And she's like, don't do that.
That is how you get shot 100% of the time.
And in a state with a stand your ground law, yeah.
Oh yeah.
So
yeah, I've read enough newspaper headlines. I don't think I'll fuck around in Florida. I know Florida man lives there, and yeah, no, I'm good.
And then also, like, Ron DeSantis getting elected is a whole other thing. But when I moved to Florida in 2013, I was a teacher with the Boys and Girls Club, like the nonprofit organization here. And I was teaching in the town that Trayvon Martin died in. So there's like a whole other level of weight of like being Black, teaching Black kids in this town. No, and this was during the trial. So yeah, Florida is a very interesting kind of melting pot of that, especially now that the laws are only getting more extreme.
Yeah, I mean, what's happening right now? It's just, I mean, fuck.
Yeah,
dude.
Yeah. No, it's bad.
If you can ever find a visa, you're welcome to come and stay here. Like, God.
I mean, mind you, I'm in sort of a safer city.
Of course, Atlanta. I mean, like, yeah.
Like, it was
as
wild,
safe as it gets, right? I mean, it's
in
still,
a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, obviously, it's America, right? So it's no like 100% safe space. But I remember we went to visit the weekend of my birthday, and we were driving around just to kind of get a feel for the city to see if it's something we'd be interested in. And we had never seen so many Black people in one space,
right?
Who were in a variety of. It was one of the few times in my life where I saw a police officer and wasn't scared because they were, you know, Black. I mean, obviously there's a whole lot of the nuance with policing and things like that, but it was like, It was like, oh my God, like there's so many of us here and we're just doing normal things. You know, we're able to be who we are, and it's not a weird or odd thing. And then I moved here, and then I saw how genuinely diverse a lot of spaces were. Where like it was almost like idyllic. Like we would drive through a park and see like a Black person and an Asian person and a white person all hanging together and like throwing a frisbee. It was like it looked like a brochure for like a community college, you know. Right. It was just like what is this? Like, this can't be real. But sure enough, it's just embraced, and people are really sweet here. It's like like I now understand the Southern hospitality thing because we've experienced it almost everywhere we've been. And so it's like I love the city, and it's great here. But I also recognize I get a little bit outside.
Oh, I've been to some of the suburbs in Atlanta, and I'm like, yeah, no, you wouldn't have liked that. No,
and I'm a city person anyway. My wife and I are both city people. Like it's like there needs to be like a little bit of noise for me to like function. If it's too quiet, I'm like, oh. And this is somebody who grew up in the suburbs. It's like even that was like pin drop quiet. It's just like it's unnerving to me. It feels like this is where more of the problems are occurring, and they're just, you can afford to kind of keep them quieter. Like there's something very honest about a gunshot in the city. It's like we can't afford to hide this.
Oh man, I'm a Brit. I'm like, there's nothing about a gunshot that should ever, just a gun should not be shot. I'm good. I'm done. Sentence over.
Right.
Why are there guns? I don't know. I actually enjoy shooting guns for sport or whatever, but we don't even do that here in the UK, you know. So it's like,
right,
not particularly.
right. Where I grew up, it's funny because when I moved to the South, like the fireworks thing, like I remember like being at like church functions, like for like 4th of July or something, and people would shoot Roman candles at each other. And I'm like, why? Why would you even think in your mind to like, and just the accessibility of like fireworks at any time. Like they sell fireworks in Target, and there will be like little signs that always make me laugh. It says, "No smoking near fireworks." I'm thinking to myself, somebody made that sign necessary, and I want to know who it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
But you go up north, and it was not like that at all. I mean, it was like, you. Or it's another thing too. You can buy alcohol in Walgreens in like the little convenience stores, and I'm like, the idea that you can buy beer and Sudafed in
Yeah.
the same establishment is just,
Yeah.
it feels,
I mean,
there's a conflict.
Walgreens is at its base level a pharmacy, right? On some level, right? It's probably evolved from that. But
Yes.
I mean, the idea you can buy
Yes.
beer at a pharmacy is, I mean, middle age at best. That should have been like kind of outgrown around 1500s.
Right.
I think at that point they were like, maybe there's better solutions than beer. Maybe a little bit later than that. I don't know. like
you go up north and you can't do that. Like they don't sell beer in those establishments. Hey, if you're in New Jersey, you can't pump gas by yourself. Like you have to have somebody come do it. Like it's a totally different world. Like you have to have permits to just shoot fireworks. You can't, and it's like lots of commercial ones. Like only you have to, or you can only get them at certain periods in the year.
Right.
In the South,
anything goes. Doesn't really matter. Add any laws. No laws.
Not really. And these are like kids like 22, 23 shooting Roman candles at each other in the street. And I'm like,
dude, you give me a firework and I'm going to have anxiety about how to set it off. And I mean, I don't even want that responsibility in my life. Like, never mind, give a teenager that.
Right. I had a sparkler in my hand, like the most like benign thing in the world. And it was like the sparks were kind of hot, but I'm like, I'm nervous just holding this. You have to have a certain confidence to hold it enough to shoot it at somebody. It's just like, next level. I don't get it. Oh my God. I don't want to get it.
Yeah. It's very foreign to me. I mean, I've been throughout all kinds of different areas of America, and it's such a fascinating playground of different approaches to life. But it's all very foreign. Yeah, man. That's crazy. Right. So I derailed your whole conversation because you started to talk about your spiritual deconstruction and how we were, I didn't want to gloss over there's so much interwoven here with faith, religion, politics. It just can't be pulled apart. And I just was so fascinated by that dynamic with the Trump era, all of that different stuff. I didn't want to like move on and then like drag it back, but but I would love as well to talk about, because this is a whole nother level, and again, can't be detached in a lot of ways. I'm sure this will still dovetail within a lot of the topics we've already talked about. But you're asking these big existential questions. You're going through this depression. Like, talk to me about how you kind of navigated that and what through that.
Oh man, like. To be perfectly frank with you, I'm amazed I made it to 2021 just because of how bad that was. It was really tough. And so
you had plenty of trips to Walgreens for beer.
Beer and Sudafed. Here's the thing, like I barely drink. Like I've never been a drinker. Like addiction runs in my family, so it's like was kind of just in my brain. It's kind of like my line in the sand.
This is why I don't drink either. My dad was an alcoholic. His dad was an alcoholic. My mom's dad was an alcoholic. So I just don't tend to drink either.
Like I've never
felt that addictive personality there. I'm addicted to pretty much everything else.
Fair enough. But me too. Sorry. I think the only major time I actually drank was when I turned 30, and that's about it. But every now and again, maybe a Mike's Hard Lemonade, but nothing too insane. And so I went on a lot of long drives to kind of like just try to clear my mind and try to figure out exactly what I was and what I believed, because you're kind of having to rebuild everything, at, in your 30s. It's like, what is that now? Because it's been a sure thing to this point. Now it's not. And so now you're in this catch-22 situation where it's like, I can live how I want, but the other side of it is like, oh shit, I can live how I want. What
Right.
is life apart from the guardrails of Christianity? What is
Yeah.
what is it outside? Like,
Especially
in
when you've been told what you want is possibly inherently evil, right? You've
yes,
been told that don't, you shouldn't go with what you want. You should be going with what God wants.
right. And by this point, I had started to shift more. Like, I had been pretty much like pro-choice for most of my Christian life, because I just never, like, I was on the abortionist murder train, but I would justify in my brain like the opposite argument of that, where it's like, if if like anti-abortion is made law, then there's no choice. And if
Mm,
there's no choice, there's no worship. Like, you're taking away a woman's ability to choose, because choice also includes no. So what you're
mm,
essentially saying is that you don't trust women, and which first presumes that that is your trust to give in the first place. So I, like, there were already ways in which my beliefs were kind of already kind of out there, and I had already been starting to move more towards in a more affirming kind of mindset, because it just didn't jive. It didn't make
right.
sense. It just felt like the only thing that held that together was homophobia, and I didn't want to be like that. So I'd started moving towards that. Um, but it was kind of like, I don't have any answers. I don't even know if I'm still a Christian anymore. I don't know any of these things. And so I was just kind of spent my days on Instagram, like, what, does anybody feel this way? Whatever. And I kind of left it alone for a while. And then one day I went through my explore page, and I found this account, and there was this person named Joe Lumen. And the way she was speaking, it was this confidence of just,
Mm,
this is harmful, first of all. So she was addressing the things that I knew to be harmful as harmful, which was powerful for me, because you could never call a spade, never really,
right.
in evangelical spaces. So she was doing that, and she was doing it in a way that was just so unapologetic, and that's so foreign to me, because
Mm,
advocating for yourself, or at least attempting to in that space, always came with like a guilt, and it always came with a wave of like, oh
mm,
God, I've offended them, when in reality it's like, their emotions really aren't my responsibility. And she arrived seemingly to my eyes with that understanding of,
right.
how you feel about what I am saying is for you to deal with. And so it made it seem like, huh, there's another way to look at this. There's another
Mm,
way of kind of existing and thinking about this. Um, and I slowly started to find accounts of people who had deconstructed. I saw your account actually was one of the first ones I saw. Um, and then there were a few others. Talk Purity to me was another one, that was like making jokes about it. And I was like, that's new. What is this? And
right.
that's when I started learning about the term deconstruction. And suddenly it was like, oh, that's what this space is.
Right.
Like, it's like finally like putting a name with a face kind of thing. It was
Mm-hmm.
this this feeling. Number one, there are more than just me feeling it, which is great, because now I know I'm not
Right.
alone. And that was enough for me to live to fight another day. Um, and slowly but surely, what pulled me out of that depression was realizing that it was possible to have life and hope past the
Mm,
evangelical space. Even if you don't know where you stand, it is possible to keep living life, and that you can kind of start making your own rules. And after a while, I started growing in confidence, and I was like, okay, I don't know what I believe, and I don't know if that really even matters right now. Um, there's a lot of things I didn't get to do that I get to do now because I don't have some oversight group looking at my every move or examining
Mm.
if I was at this place with this person. And so that reality began to unlock some freedom in me. And so I began to have a little bit of fun after a while, like just doing some things I just never would do. I remember like listening to bands that I thought were evil, like driving to like the grocery store blasting Slipknot just because I could. Like, like this is like little stuff that's symbolic of like,
Yeah.
oh, I don't have to listen, I don't have to abide by your rules anymore. Um, which feels juvenile to find that out at like 31 years old or however old I
Mm.
was when I figured it out. But it was just like, wow, like there's another life is possible. And so began to think about that and just kind of soak in a lot of content within the deconstruction space and just listen and learn just a lot of different perspectives about how some people were still Christians but had more of I don't want to say progressive, but a way of believing in which hell wasn't real or that you could be affirming of LGBTQIA people. And I was like, I don't know if I am going to go down this route, but it's cool to know that it's possible.
Yeah.
That it's cool to know that there really aren't any limits on this, and that to establish a sense of limit is really arrogant,
Hmm.
because it presumes that I've had things the right way around and everybody else is just tripping. So I
Right.
can't, and so you begin to walk through that. But because I was coming out of the fog of depression, it was easier to bear the knowledge that, hey, I had been involved in this, because it's like, okay, now I can make better choices.
Yeah.
Because even if I don't have a direct pathway forward, I know that I can cobble bits and pieces together to make something happen.
Sure.
Um, and so that was going on. And around that time, the story of what had happened to me at that last church was just swimming in me. And so I just wrote about it. I just wrote one little quick little thing. And I told my friends about in the group chat about it. Um, and they're like, cool, cool. And I wrote it and I sat on it because I was scared. I was scared of persecution. I was scared of people coming after me and blah, blah, blah. And mind you, I wrote it in such a way that I didn't list any names,
Mm.
but people who would read it would know who it is if they were involved in that. And so every couple of months, like I sat on like the first thread, what will become the first how I left my church thread,
Right.
or why I left my church thread. I sat on that thing for like 6 months, and because I was just
Wow.
scared of putting it out. And my one friend, she hit me up every couple of months, like, "Hey man, so how's the thread coming?" You know, just kind of like lighting the fire into my ass, like, and it's just
Right.
like, I'm like, it's coming. I would just like make little tweaks here or there, but not really give it the due diligence I would give something that I was actually seriously writing. Because I would, by this point, I would be on like a third draft or something,
Right.
or like a revision or something. Um, but then after about 6 months, I was like, you know what? They may feel some way about this. Tough shit. I feel like I need to get this out of me so that way it doesn't threaten my brain space anymore, because
Mm.
if it does, I'm gonna go back to that dark place and I can't afford to go back there. um so I put it out, not with any idea that it would do anything more than just be me speaking
Yeah.
and sharing. And suddenly I started getting all of these messages from people who had left before I had left.
Mm.
And what was interesting was that the narrative surrounding them leaving was always the same. They just couldn't hang. Uh, they were bitter. A lot of that, like they were just bitter and angry at leadership, and it was attached to a ton of people.
Hmm.
But more and but there were like 10 messages, and it was people like, "Thank you for saying this, because I haven't been able to say this for 3 years. 4 years, or this thing that you said had an effect. This thing that you said had an effect. And so I began putting out more of them. And initially I had planned on only doing like 3. It turned into 8 because there was I thought, because I was just after
Right.
that point I started writing them, and it just kind of more things started coming out of me that I didn't even realize. There were just these recessive memories that just like lived somewhere for a long time that I didn't think about. Um, and it was one of those things that kind of drew a lot of people's eyes to it, including people from the old church.
Mm.
So like they would like be snooping on my like Instagram feeds from other accounts, because I was pretty much exposing a lot of
Right.
stuff, and in some cases sort of the psychopathy behind a lot of things. And it was very surface level stuff like, this is what a flying monkey is, this is what triangulation is, this is what groupthink means. These are like, so if you're familiar with Mike Bickle, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and for those who aren't, Mike Bickle is the leader of International House of Prayer out of Kansas City. And they have other chapters all over the country, one in Orlando actually. And so interestingly enough, Mike Bickle was a hero of a lot of the guys in that old church.
Right.
And what's funny is I got to tie it all together in one of these threads where Mike Bickle had written this thing about, here are 7 signs you're in a cult. And mind you, the church had hit like 5, 6 of them.
Right.
And
And
I
like,
got
let's be honest, if any church kind of movement, like where it's like, wow, this is pot calling kettle black, right? I mean, IHOP is way culty, like about as culty as it gets. Yeah.
Have you ever
I'm
seen one of their
like,
24-hour, like one of their 24-hour prayer things?
been to them, man. Chill
Oh
out.
yeah.
Not in Kansas, but yeah. I'm
Yeah.
like, I'm very familiar with IHOP. Yeah.
Yeah.
They're intense. They're intense. And you know what? Yeah, you know, if you believe it, like I kind of am like, yeah, hats off. IHOP. You kind of really threw yourself behind that. You believed it.
Yeah.
Maybe not
And then
in some other ways, but yeah.
yeah, I mean, every so often there's a group that kind of rises to prominence.
Mm,
And it like shifts every, say, 5 or 6 years. So for a long time it was Jesus culture, and then Jesus culture went, and then Bethel, and then
mhm.
Bethel, and then it's Upper Room. And then now like it's not so much a church, but you see Maverick City music, which you can say a lot of encouraging things about in a lot of ways, because they helped to, because they didn't compromise in a lot of ways. They were talking about Black Lives Matter
Mm,
at a moment when a lot of Christians were not talking about it. So I give them a lot of credit for that. But I also can recognize that like there may be some ways in which they are maybe being tokenized themselves.
mm,
And I don't know that they're necessarily trying to do that. But I think without trying to do that, I think they give a lot of other organizations and ministries cover. In particular, Bethel, in particular, a lot of these other places, of like, we're not racist. See, we platform these people. You
yeah.
know, it's a get out of racism free card. You know, for a lot of folks, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But IHOP was always one of those consistent ones that always kind of like the beam of static behind all of that. Um, and so when I read what Mike Bickle had to read, I was like, well, this is hilarious and so timely. And so to be able to kind of make the connection for a lot of folks was sort of a big deal for that immediate community. And it helped
Mm,
reignite conversations amongst people who had left, people who hadn't talked in a while, who had been separated without a whole lot of clarity as to why this person left and I stayed here. Like it brought people together in a really odd way.
mm,
And I wasn't expecting any of that. And so now it kind of and so now it kind of lives as this like statement of how I got into sort of the deconstruction space, as it were. But also for a lot of people who didn't go to that church, but who saw similar stuff happen in
mm.
their church. Because I heard a lot of that too. Of like, oh my God, a church, my pastor did something similar, or my church did this. And it was just further evidence that like okay, this isn't happening in a vacuum. This is
Yeah.
actually like, this isn't the exception. It might just be the rule.
Yeah.
Um, and so it was a learning experience as much as I was educating,
Mm.
for me. And it's kind of, in a lot of words, we're in a lot of ways kind of set the tone for what I kind of do now on Instagram, which, you know, it shifts depending on, you know, time and what's happening. But in general, it's kind of, it's one of a number of things. If it's not personal stuff, it's uh about racism. Like, I just posted today about it, actually, talking about how there's a lot of conversation here in America specifically about critical race theory,
Hmm.
uh, which has existed since the late 80s, if I'm not mistaken, and was taught in law schools. But because they don't want to talk about racism, they just demonize critical race theory as this thing and say that kids are too young to learn about these things. Um, but most Black people, you know, or have met, probably have stories of when they were in first, second grade experiencing stuff. So
Yeah.
it's like, so Black kids are old enough to experience racism at 6, but a white kid at 6 can't learn about it.
Mm.
And so I was talking about, today in particular, I was talking about how over the course of his life, George Washington had well over 300 slaves. Um, and he had slaves for most of his life. And actually inherited slaves when he got married, because Martha was a widow by the time she married George, and had inherited
Right.
80 slaves of her own. So it was this huge thing. Um, he would renounce it later and say, like, on upon the death of his wife, release all the slaves. But he didn't have legal standing to do that because it was in opposition of the law at the time. So all the slaves just got bequeathed to their kids. But ultimately, the thing I was honing in on was that he was given slaves by his father on his deathbed as a birthday present. And there's 10 slaves that George Washington was given on his 11th birthday. Very recently, we had a
Right.
story that broke today, actually, about a superintendent at a school in North Carolina who had to apologize because his students were engaging in a mock slave auction where they were essentially pretending to auction off their Black classmates.
Fuck.
And the thing about this is that this is the second time in the last 2 years I've heard something like this. The difference is that the last one was in high school, and that it was happening independently of the teacher's knowledge. So the kids were just doing it by themselves. Um, in this case, we're talking middle school kids who are a little bit younger, um, and it happened in the view of faculty. And so there's a lot of questions about that now. Like, did they know? How much do they know? And will they suffer any repercussions if they did?
Yeah.
And so it's like, it's this conversation about what's too young to learn about it. It's like, well, for the people experiencing it, they're not too young. So why? Let's just get rid of that entirely. You're
Hmm.
uncomfortable. And if anything, the younger generations have shown a greater willingness to discuss these topics.
Yeah.
Like, I am so excited about what Gen Z is doing, what Generation Alpha is doing, because they're way more willing to go there than even my
Yeah.
generation was.
Yeah.
And we're pretty progressive in terms of
Hmm.
what we wanted in comparison to what, like, Generation X wanted and even the baby boomers wanted. Um, so I'm excited for the next generation, but it's me sort of just trying to say, like, let's call a spade a spade.
Yeah.
Let's deal with this as it is, because
Yeah.
we're not going to move forward unless we actually just look at it as it stands. Like, this is who you are. Like, we hear Joe Biden say this here all the time, like, that racism is not America. And I'm like,
Are you
mm,
fucking kidding?
mm.
Jesus.
I'm like,
Yeah.
every January we celebrate Dr. King, who became a public figure because of what you said America isn't.
Yeah.
Like, you can't
Yeah.
have it both ways.
Yeah. We have the same. I laugh because my wife's a teacher and they do this thing where they teach British values. It's really quite scary how much Britain seems to be following a trajectory of where America is right now, which is terrifying. To me, it seems like a very big regression. But they've started doing this thing where they teach in school British values. And I understand like this can be helpful for understanding like what is this country like? You know, what's it about? Yeah, let's talk about the fact that we came up with concentration camps. Let's talk about the fact we colonized the entire. Oh, no. Oh, our British values are tolerance and, you know, and whatever. And I'm like, are you fucking kidding? We're the least tolerant country on the earth. Like, it's just like these fascinating, like whitewashed kind of like things that we've decided. And it's like, and you know what? I get it. You know, you're 4. Let's not talk about concentration camps yet. Like, I get it. Let's wait till you're 6 or 7. But like, it's just this like weird need to brainwash kids and make sure they don't talk about anything we're uncomfortable with, so that we can establish a narrative, because, you know, we're talking about race. We're just talking about the way we want to talk about it. And once you're at an age where we've properly conditioned you, or we just lose control of you, then we'll accept that that's going to happen. But hopefully we've said enough shit down there, right deep down in the gooey parts, that's going to make it really hard to like let you really deal with some of that stuff that we've established. And that's really what it's about, right? I mean, you face this. I talk with I won't say who. I talk with some people very often who go on and on and on about how well, education is so liberal because all the teachers are very liberal. And I'm like, yeah, because they're fucking educated. But let's not go there. And they're like, so they're just making all our kids liberal, and they're talking, and kids are like, you know, they're talking about things like homosexuality. And I'm like, yeah, we should talk about homosexuality. And can you believe they're like, well, maybe we should accept homosexuality. I'm like, what the fuck are we talking? Like, maybe we should. And I'm like, and you want to be the person that's teaching a child because you don't think someone should accept a homosexual. That's why you want to teach a child. That's why you don't want a liberal teaching your child. Let's not kid ourselves. It's not about education here. It's about controlling the narrative. It's always about going back and controlling narratives about what we teach. It's just, it's appalling, right? It's George Washington's old enough to have slaves. But at the same age, we can't possibly start talking about the repercussions of that whole shit show and where we are today because of it. That's just, we couldn't possibly talk about it yet. You have to be 28 to have a conversation about it. And even then, you do it in a private WhatsApp group and don't let anyone know.
Exactly. And the thing is, it's like with all these laws they're trying to pass, because Lord knows there are like 1.5 million like bills they're trying to pass. And once one place does it, another place swatches it. It's like,
all these like small government people love their fucking laws, don't they? Jesus Christ.
They sure do.
That's amazing.
They sure do. It's like we want everyone to have the freedoms we say they have. Because like once one organization starts doing, we saw this with the abortion law in Texas. As soon as that passed, it was like Florida drew something up. I think Georgia did. Arkansas, Arkansas, I think Alabama drew something up. Like, it was just one thing after another. And same thing with like anti-CRT language, which is hilarious because it's kind of a dummy law, because nobody under the age of 23 is being taught about critical race theory, and it's only really law students. Like, this is taught in law school. It's not being taught in school. Like, I mean, there's a lot of things you could talk about in terms of flaws in education. And this is coming from a former teacher. It's like, you know, it bothers me, and it has bothered me that, you know, we never taught kids how to, you know, pay taxes or what the nuances of that are.
Right.
But man, like, if you don't know the Pythagorean theorem, you are at risk of not graduating. Or like the fact that my graduation to high school was more dependent on my ability to spell Tchaikovsky than anyone's ability to know who Marcus Garvey was, or anyone who actually looks like me. It's that kind of dynamic. It's like I had to know white history.
Yeah.
It's like most white people have to know Black history to seem like they're cultured to get into college. In order to get out of high school, I had to know a ton of stuff about white history,
right?
Almost predominantly. It's that thing. But the thing about all of these laws and all these things they're trying to do is that they're virtually impossible to police without completely devolving into McCarthyism. It's just like, you're a communist, you're a communist. Like it's the same thing
Right.
over and over again. And so it's like, how do you actually plan on policing this while teaching actual American history? Because kids know about slavery because slavery has been taught all this time without critical race theory. Critical
Mhm.
race theory is just attached to the knowledge you already have. It's saying, okay, so we know this happened. What was the effect of all of these things on the way things are built, the way architecture happened? Because racism is a part of all of that. Like
Mhm.
you hear stories about, I think it was Robert Moses, who was this architect, and don't quote me on this, I believe it was Robert Moses, who intentionally made certain overpasses shorter so that buses couldn't get into uh, certain communities of color,
Right.
or the fact that what you call it, interstates would run right through cities, separating Black communities from white communities. That was intentional. That was
Right.
planning. What I always tell people is like, if racism isn't real, then why is there a hood in every city? It was planned. If you go to Orlando, what they call the hood literally falls on the far side of I think it's called Division Avenue. And it was called Division Avenue by choice. They did it because it was literally the divider line between the Black neighborhood and the white neighborhood. Like, it's a part of zoning, it's a part of all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And that is what critical race theory analyzes. It's saying, what is the effect of this on people? Like the average, like, I think wealth of a Black family is, well, the average wealth of a white family, I think it's like 140 or 150,000 people in $150,000 in America. The average wealth of a Black family is about $17,000. So it's like, why is there such a disparity? Okay, because laziness does not equate to a difference of $100,000 or more.
Right.
Um, if
It's just
anything,
astonishing.
which I mean, if anything, what's lazy about it is the argument. It's intellectually lazy to assume that people just don't want to work hard enough and not acknowledge the fact that it's like, for every 5 homeless people I met in Orlando, 3 of them are veterans. You really want to walk up to a veteran, somebody who served in Vietnam, and tell them they didn't work hard enough?
Right.
Let's see how that goes for you. Like, it's one of those things where it's like the dynamic is so based on these narratives that aren't true, but are believed because they satisfy a narrative for some people.
Yeah.
And when all the rules are made for some people, then everybody else has to kind of deal with the fallout from that.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that, in a variety of avenues, not just racism, but like the way that COVID is handled in America.
Yeah.
Like how unbelievably ableist the attitude
Right.
is. It's like, Biden was like, get back to work, blah, 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 blah. Well, I'm sorry, but if I'm someone who has comorbidities, like,
It's not safe to do it.
like COVID will take me out. Like if like, and these are people who can't get the vaccine. Like,
Mhm.
you're not talking about people who have sickle cell, who probably run the risk of having real issues either way. It's going to affect my body if I get the vaccine, but if I don't and I get COVID, now I have COVID related pneumonia. How is that going to affect the situation?
Yeah.
And it's this like stunning lack of nuance.
Yeah. What's it's the inability to see beyond myself. I talked to someone recently who just is like, well, everyone should just get COVID anyway. And what's fascinating is they have one of their children has a disability, and in the rankings of what disabilities are most affected by COVID for fatalities, it's the #1 disability that would result in death. And they're like, oh, we just don't care. And this is in the UK. And by the way, this person gives vaccinations. They are an actual vaccination nurse. So like, fuck. Like these are really intelligent people, very intelligent people, really great people, lovely people, wonderful people. But the inability, like if you can't see your own child as a resultant of this kind of like, well, it would work for me. It's not surprising Biden can't see a whatever, fill in the blank, right? Someone that is not a geriatric old man. Like, I don't know. Which, by the way, geriatric old men probably not likely to do well either. But fuck me, I don't know. Like, it's just like, what is happening?
Like, he would fall in that, like, just based on his age. He's 79 years old. He would fall in that range of people who would be greatly affected by that.
Yeah.
Now, thankfully, I believe he's vaccinated, so that helps a lot.
Absolutely.
But like, for example, like I worked in a hospital for all of 2021, and say for like maybe the last month or so. And one of the things that I found interesting was how little people understood what the effect was on the local hospital.
Yeah.
Like, because it's not just that the hospitals are overrun with COVID. Everybody knows that. It's the look in the eyes of COVID nurses when they have to come get something from downstairs because it's unsafe for the family members to bring it up. It's the look on the face of the family members when they get to the hospital and realize they can't. And I'm usually the first one to talk to them, and they're looking at me like, we haven't seen him. We want to see him. It's like, I get it, but it's at the point now where half the hospital has COVID, and this will get you sick if you get close to it. Like, you got nurses walking in near hazmat suits, and that's just one side of the hospital. You go to the ER, and that creates a whole other issue because, number one, people aren't being seen for upwards of 22 hours. And I remember, like, when I was working at the ER briefly, I was there for a day, and the wait time was about anywhere from 16 to about 20 hours just to be seen, whether you had COVID or not. What gets buried in all of that is that outside of COVID, people are just going to need a hospital.
Yeah.
So
people don't stop getting sick, you know.
Exactly. Just because COVID exists doesn't mean all other things stop existing. Like, that's like you getting COVID or somebody in your town getting COVID is not going to stop little Timmy from breaking his arm when he falls out of a tree. He's going to need to go somewhere, and now he has to sit and wait for 16 hours, in some cases outside, because the hospital's at capacity. So now you have people sitting outside on the ground, you know, on benches.
Or you're inside hotboxing fucking COVID for 22 hours. Like, I mean, pick your choice, right?
And then you're dealing with impatient people who don't want to be vaccinated, who are angry that people aren't being seen in a timely fashion. On top of that, you have the nurses who have the unenviable task of having to triage that.
Yeah.
And for those who aren't familiar, there are certain nurses in ERs who have to decide who gets seen based on level of importance. So it's like, if I am coming in and I don't know what's wrong, but then there's a person who is running 104 fever, the person with the 104 fever is going to get priority because that's a much more tenuous situation than what I'm dealing with, because we know what that is. But if I'm a nurse, and it's like I have to decide between COVID and the man over there who is clearly jaundiced, and which was something I saw one night. It was like a dude who was sitting there just yellow as all could be. And it's all of these little micro situations that don't get talked about on a massive scale.
No.
That require both forethought and empathy. Which, as an American, are two things Americans are not generally good at. Like, a lot of Americans are in a situation where the situation is set up for them and they believe what they're told, so they don't actually have to do the hard work of critical thinking. I don't have that luxury. I have to think critically just to kind of get around. So it's those little things that just don't kind of get completely swept under the rug. And like you're saying, there are people who are willing to risk the lives of people they care about. But I don't know if it's like that in the UK, but in here, it's a much more political thing where like not getting vaccinated as a personal choice falls on political lines because people would rather trust the former host of The Apprentice than a guy who's literally served as a virologist and a doctor under 6 presidents over the course of 35 years,
Yeah.
most of whom were Republican. Like, you look at Fauci and you look at all the presidents he sat under: Reagan, Clinton, both times, George W. Bush, both times, Barack Obama, Trump, and Biden. Most of those people are Republicans. So they're not going to be in favor of that. And he's still telling you, and it's still not enough.
Yeah.
So
it's again, it's this weird dynamic of this weird bled dynamic of religion and politics and faith and race. I mean, it's all just this weird hodgepodge.
Yeah, that, there.
You know, people are like, well, I'm a Christian, I'm not going to get vaccinated. And I know lots of Christians get vaccinated, or, you know, but sure, it's like, wow, what does, so you think I'm a Christian, so I'm not going to get vaccinated, or I'm a, you know, like the vote, the Christian choice. And I'm like, well, you go into the historically Black church, well, they all mostly vote Democrat. So clearly a Christian choice in that movement is Democrat.
I'm so glad you said that. I'm so glad you said that, because there's a lot of people who are Christians who are trying to prevent certain people of color from voting. So, for example, like you mentioned, in a predominantly Black space, like 95% of the vote is Democrat, because a lot of what the Republican Party has become opposes them. And so they see that, and it's like, yeah, no, we're not doing that. But a lot of churches have this initiative called Souls to the Polls, where they go directly after church and go vote. And so in the original laws for, I think Georgia was one of the states that tried to put these voter kind of blocks in place. And one of the things they tried to do in the original draft of the bill was eliminate Souls to the Polls, because they want to make sure that the Black vote does not happen. And they know that the Black church is a huge driver of social change. It's why, like, when you look at the civil rights movement, what kicked off what we think about, because the civil rights movement has existed forever, but really, like, going back to Harriet Tubman, like, it wasn't called that, but that's what it is. What we know as a civil rights movement started in 1963 because of the bombing of a church, and 4 little girls were killed. And that's kind of like the flashpoint where they said, okay, enough is enough. And a lot of marches, a lot of sit-ins, a lot of stuff happened in the wake of that. But I think about the fact that they bombed a Black church, and I'm thinking, they must know that this is where Black people feel safe. And I don't want them to feel safe, so I need to get rid of this. I want them to scatter. And so, boom. There was a shooting at a church in Charleston in 2015. Same thing. You know, and so there is this sense that, like, the white church is the dominant one, and that the Black church only exists as a function of culture. Like, like, we only appreciate the Black church insofar as it gave us Aretha Franklin and Whitney Houston. We only appreciate it insofar as the feeling I get when I hear a choir, but not in the fact that, oh, like, these people actually have a whole different way of worshiping. These people are no less worshipful than you. You know, I mean, if you've ever been in a Black church, you can sense the
people's passion.
Right? And passion is just one word to describe it, because even within that, there are different ways in which it's celebrated within the Black culture. You go to a Baptist church, you'll have a very, very different experience than you do if you walk into a Church of God in Christ, where, you know, now you're getting into praise breaks. Well, what is a praise break? Like, there's all these different dynamics, even within that you wouldn't know about if all you saw was the Black church, and you see it as kind of a threat, and kind of, or something that's cute if you take it seriously at all. And so it's this thing that's kind of treated as this, like, auxiliary thing that logically exists. You know, it's like, oh yeah, cool, TD Jakes. You know, like, that's about it. Um, but it doesn't deal with the fact that number one, a lot of people don't take it seriously. And number two, if they do, it's because they're taking the preaching styles of Black preachers.
Mm.
Um, you see this with Paula White. If you're familiar with Paula White,
Hmm.
she completely adopted her preaching style from Black preachers. There's no argument about that. Same thing with Rod Parsley. Like, Rod Parsley has praise breaks in his churches, which is a decidedly Black church thing. So it's like, it's there for cultural extraction and not to be
Yeah.
taken seriously. It's a weird, like, the
Mm.
relationship between the Black church and the common, like, church zeitgeist in America is really
Yeah.
weird.
Yeah, there's an interesting dynamic. So I'm so intrigued by this, and I'm so far removed, and we are in a very white space in deconstruction, and I
Mhm.
would love to talk to you about that. But maybe just before that, I'm intrigued in your thoughts of what it is like to
I can't
deconstruct.
hear you.
Did you lose my volume? You got me? Anything?
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
Cut it. There's a unique experience to deconstruct and be Black.
Mhm.
Obviously, everything is unique to each individual based on their demographics in so many different ways. But um, you know, it can't be unsaid how much a part of being Black, being Christian is in America for a large part. And obviously, it's quite intriguing to me because you existed outside of a lot of those Black spaces to some degree, being in the evangelical church, which is
Right.
not a Black space. And so I know that there's a dynamic for some Black people as they deconstruct that it's not, when we leave evangelical spaces, we lose our family, friends, communities. A lot of things can go.
Yeah.
But I think for a lot of people in those spaces, like the historically Black church, you start to deconstruct your faith. I mean, it's a whole other level of community, security, everything, right? Um,
Mhm.
and I'm so intrigued by this. Do you have thoughts on um, what's going on in and we'll probably just stay within the realm of America because this is such a culturally complex thing, but in
Sure.
in the American Black population, it's
Mhm.
such a Christian space, at least culturally, but I think very much beyond that for most people. Do you get a sense that there is a big degree of deconstruction occurring? Do you think there is a lot of that going on, or do you think that there's, because I often wonder to some degree, you're in an evangelical space. I'm like, dude, it's a ticking time bomb. As a Black man in the evangelical church, you're going to start questioning some of this shit, right? But there's a question of the Black church evolved differently, right? The Black church doesn't have to deconstruct colonization from its faith as much because they've done that work over the last 100+ years. They've been looking at this faith going, shit, slavery is a part of the Bible. We need to deal with that. We need to look at that. We need to process. They've looked at certain parts. The Black church has looked at violence. The Black church has looked at nationalism and some of these big components that it seems that the white church in America hasn't looked at. And I'm so intrigued by, it feels like there's maybe less fires under the ass of the average Black person in the American in a Black church than there would be in a Black person in the evangelical church, to put it kind of funnily or whatever. But
Right.
um and again, this is so from my you know distance, looking across the ponds, talking to people here and there. But I'm really intrigued. Do you have thoughts on those dynamics?
So,
Yeah.
so here's what's interesting. So, having spent time in both spaces, so when I first started coming into church, it was in a Black church. So the
Okay.
first couple churches were Black churches. So there's, in terms of what the Black church needs to deconstruct, I think there is still some margin of things to deconstruct in terms of theology, just
Mhm.
because there are a lot of Black preachers who got their theology from white folks.
Right.
So there is a little something there. Also, the manner in which the LGBTQ community is treated within the Black community is a weird thing because there's a lot of homophobia, a lot of transphobia, and you see a lot of that in church spaces where they'll be members of choirs or they'll lead choirs and be wonderful at it. And it'll be kind of this like poorly kept secret, but nobody ever acknowledges it. Or if they do, it's to denounce it. So it's sort of like the Jackie Hill Perry situation, or Donnie McClurkin, who is a gospel singer, who talked about how he sort of overcame homosexuality is his phraseology for it. And so there's that element of things. There's like a bunch of artists historically that we know are, if they're not telling us they're gay, it kind of gives the appearance that they might be.
Right. It's the elephant in the room that doesn't get talked about.
Right. I want to say there was an artist, Tone, who came out, and it kind of killed his career within the Black community for a while. Even though his ideas were brilliant and way ahead of their time. He was embracing like different genres of music, like rock and different things that really weren't being embraced in that way in gospel music at the time that he did it. And so he laid the groundwork for a lot of people to follow, but probably won't be referenced in the same way because of what he admitted. And you saw a similar thing happen a ton of times in the white space. I think it's Jennifer Knapp. If you look at the way that Jars of Clay were treated after they became affirming, it effectively ended their careers.
Right.
So there's a lot of common ground, more than you might think, in terms of theology, in terms of like, that was the Black church was the first place I heard somebody say that, somebody at my pulpit said that gay people were freaks. And this was 2003.
Yeah, it doesn't shock me.
So it's and mind you, 2003, this is still when gay is still considered an insult. We're maybe 6 years removed from Ellen coming out and that being a huge deal. So it's there's a lot of tension, but there's a lot of upholding of tradition in Black communities and Black spaces. And that can create some tension when you try to think about things differently when it comes to like relationships and things like that. There's a lot of conversations about abuse in the Black community where it's like it gets swept under the rug because you need to respect your elders, and so you don't speak ill of them. It's like, well, no, I'm just telling you what they did so that they can be held accountable. But they're and we saw that with Bill Cosby, how many people kind of came to the defense of Bill Cosby, which kind of horrified me. Because I mean, I had been hearing about Bill Cosby my whole life, growing up outside of Philly. Bill Cosby was a huge contributor to Temple University, which is in North Philadelphia. And so you heard about him every other news cycle. Or the way that people in the Black community are dealing with Kanye right now. And how they're willing to kind of go to bat for him when the reality is that what he is doing is abusive. Pure and simple. Some of that is, I think they want to defend him because they know how the system treats Black men. So there's a tension of like wanting to hold you accountable, but also not wanting to see you railroaded by the system. Which is why a lot of crimes don't get reported, actually. But because we're not taken seriously. Like a lot of like sexual assaults and things in the Black community, especially when it comes to Black women, are not reported at a far lesser degree. They're reported at a far less degree than they are white women because white women have more of an audience, Black women don't. Right. So there's a lot of these weird points that the Black Christian community needs to deal with still. So we've tackled a lot of these issues, but it's not from this place of we need to tackle this issue because it's affecting America. It's like we're tackling these issues because it's a life or death situation. They are going to, if we are not organized, if we are not aware, that's what the entire purpose behind Stay Woke was. I've had to have this conversation like 6 times, like in the last couple of months, but more than that, actually, just because I think that word woke gets thrown around. But the reality
Mm.
is it was designed for Black people to keep themselves safe in an age where if you were accused of looking at a white woman, that's your whole community. You look at Black Wall Street, it was based on the presumption of rape without any due process.
Mm.
They thought a Black man assaulted a woman on an elevator because a woman said so. Um, but they didn't take them to the authorities, none of that. They went and they burned down the entire Black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, because not because of the rape. So they weren't even actually trying to do her any justice. They were looking for any reason to burn that community down, and now they
Mm.
had one. Um, so what was another one? Same thing with Emmett Till. I want to say that Emmett Till's accuser later, well after he was killed, said she made it up.
Yeah, I remember that.
And I say that with some reticence because this is a serious thing and should be taken seriously every time. So if a woman says that she's been assaulted, my default is I'm going to believe her.
Yeah.
And honestly, that feels appropriate, you know? So even if you believe her, then have him arrested. You know,
Yeah.
like I think that if Black or white, if you do the crime, do the time. You know, like I am not anti-accountability. And I do think that sexual assault should be taken seriously. These things, I just want to be clear
Yeah.
about that. But when you know that they're looking for any reason to do more and then
Yeah.
justify it on the back end, you arrive at certain situations thinking a little bit differently. So they were saying, yo, like stay woke, they killing us out here. Like stay aware, stay alert.
Mm.
And now that's become this evil thing where it's like wokeness is like destroying. I'm like, yeah, being aware of people is destroying.
Yeah.
You know, like I told somebody recently, like one of the great marvels of modern history is how a group of white pastors managed to weaponize caring. Like it's like that's really what it is. But to get back to what the question you asked me, I think there's a lot for the church to do. There's a lot for the
Yeah.
Black church to do still.
Yeah.
There still is this exalting of tradition over necessary change.
Mm.
And that lives out different, that plays out differently in Black church than it does in the white church. But I mean, it's present in both.
Sure. It's a systemic component, really, of
Right.
church or
Exactly.
Christianity, or maybe most religions in some way.
Right. You look at the John Cooper situation, and a lot of people in the deconstruction space very wisely pointed out that there are still some churches in which John Cooper could not be accepted
Right.
because of his tattoos. And I'm like, he's attacking deconstruction while having gotten to the place he got by way of deconstruction. He just doesn't realize it. In the same way, there's a lot of people who were willing to do different things in musical environments, in sermon illustrations. There's a lot of people who had to take apart something. There are people with tattoos, more tattoos. I have one. There are people with way more tattoos than I do who are in church worshiping. But even that had to be worked through.
Yeah.
Because there's still the thinking of like, thou you shall not mark your body, or blah blah blah, or if you belong to a certain church, you need to dress a certain way. Or just the attitude of, well, and I'm gonna say this just because I don't know very much about it, but my wife tells me stories about her upbringing and how in the Church of God in Christ there was this saying like, you can't join in, you have to be born in. And which is interesting because people do join, but it's this thing that kind of like was like left over from past, and I'm never really sure about what that means, but it hints at a sort of an exclusivity that, you know, exists again in both the Black church and the white church.
Sure. Yeah.
You know, so if a white person walks into a Black church, it's almost like, what they doing here? like there's like this like shadow acceptance, but it's just kind of like, it's kind of weird for like the first 45 minutes. It's like, huh. And it's almost like you're laughing in your head because you're probably already realizing like, yo, they probably feel like they are in another dimension.
Oh yeah. Like, yeah. there's got to be a small bit of pleasure that you take in going, you have a feeling of what it's like to be the only person of your race in a room right now, and you've probably never felt that in your life, like on some level, right? It must be a good feeling to just like go, huh. I don't know, maybe someone that's going to step into a black church in the first place is probably maybe a lot more self-aware, or I don't know why someone would find themselves in that situation. But
I mean, you get a bit of both. Like sometimes you'll get people who are like, I don't understand this, but y'all are dope. And most times it's like, okay, we can work with that. Like, you're like, look, I recognize that I'm the foreign party here, and that there's a lot of grace involved in you accepting me into this space. So because of that, it's like, look, I know I'm the white guy here, but y'all are incredible and I love what you're doing. And so there's a lot of like trying to engage. And so it's funny sometimes because you can see the cultural differences like just rubbing up against each other, but that willingness to like want to join in and want to actually like value the community for what it is without like trying to appropriate it. Like, I can work with that. And there's actually a lot of that in the deconstruction space. Not enough of it, but it does exist. There are a lot of people who are like, look, as much as I can get it, I get it. And I'm going to try to figure this out. I know, and they'll say like, I know you're not under any obligation to educate me. And I know that too, but like the educator in me can't let that go. So I'm always going to want to do it just because that's kind of just how I function. All that being said, there is that element still in deconstruction space. But to kind of piggyback on what you were just saying about what that person might feel like, of like, oh, I'm the only person of my kind here. It's like when you leave that space, you will walk out knowing the rest of the world will accept you. Especially if you're a white man. You will leave that space knowing the rest of the world will accept you. If I walk into a white space, I'm looked at as like the new kid in school, where it's like that story. I think Bill Clinton said that he didn't go to school with black people until he was in college in like the 60s, and which is wild to think about, but makes a lot of sense. It's kind of like that, where it's like, if I've been the only black person in a white space with white people who are not used to being around black people. And so the questions they ask you, the curiosities they have, a lot of them are microaggressions, even if they mean it well. But the problem is, it's like, if I get accepted here, it's on your terms. The second I start stretching out, then I'm the black guy again. I'll have a name until I start wanting to be black. But when I leave, but the reality is I'm still black here. And when I leave here, you can accept me all you want. When I leave here, I'm still black. I'm asking you, as like people in those spaces, to care about both sides, because that contributes to my humanity. But yeah, all that to say, I think, it's not that the black church doesn't have a fire under its ass. I think it just has different fires. I think it has, and the motivation behind the things that it has put out is different. So for predominantly white spaces, their incentive is to have more diverse spaces. But really what they're saying when they say more diverse is less white, which means we want to look out and see less white people. The culture doesn't have to change at all, but we just want other people to come in and sit in our culture, not recognizing that in order to accept other cultures, a cultural shift is what it's going to require. And that's not going to happen if your entire board of directors is white, if all your elders are white. It's
that's an entirely external pressure decision as well. Because let's face it, if it wasn't because the college had to have person of every color on the cover book or whatever, they wouldn't give a fuck. They would just go, all right, yeah, like who do I well, white people are the prettiest, or white people are, don't put that person in a wheelchair, or that person's too fat, or right. Like, let's not kid ourselves. Most people are thinking through these really ableist, fat phobic, transphobic, black phobic, right? I mean, like, just total lens. And the church, my God, how much, like, yeah, I mean, because you're saying like, oh, it would be nice if it looked a little less white. But the truth is, probably wouldn't be nice if it looked a little less white. I'm just doing that because I have to, right?
Yeah.
On some level. I mean, I imagine for a huge percentage of churches out there, white churches, yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's unfair.
I mean, there's a certain degree of like mental gymnastics or like the affirmative action thing in your head where it's like, I need to have this to fit a quota. Or if I want more people of this people group to come in because I see them as a people group to conquer, then yeah, like that's more what the mindset was for the church we were in.
That's interesting.
We were kind of an asset to them purely in the sense that we were Black, so that way we could reach Black people.
Yes.
So because there really weren't a lot of Black people out there being missionaries in the way that we were being missionaries, and it wasn't just stateside. Like we were in Sweden, we were in Colombia, we were in all kinds of places. And even there, the cultural issues from America's kind of reared its head, because we were staying at a hostel, and the woman there would force me and another gentleman on the trip who was Filipino to take our hats off. And she said to me, like, men don't wear hats, in her accent. She had a really thick Swedish accent. And she would laugh and chuckle. And I'm like, you're judging my entire manhood based on the presence of headwear, but we'll move on. And it wasn't until I looked into the kitchen, not even seconds after that, and I see a white man in a baseball cap. I bet you. And she had to leave the kitchen to come to see me.
Right. Just walk right past the guy.
So I mentioned that to them. I mentioned that to my leadership team, which was largely white. And if they weren't white, it was a person who was non-white but was a Trump supporter. So it's like if they're not white, then they are sort of adjacent to whiteness in terms of a power structure. And so the thing they said to me when I tried to address it was that if first of all, it was silence from almost everyone. And then one of them, a person who had gone off on me years prior because they felt like the Black Lives Matter movement was racist towards white people, unprovoked, I should point out, said to me, Ben, you're more of a Christian than a Black person. And I'm like, okay, but that, and that was the end of the conversation. They just kind of didn't push it further than that. Almost like saying, like, you shouldn't push this because now you're just making basically kind of, it's gaslighting is really what it was. But that little sentiment of like, you're more Christian than you are Black. I'm like, I bet you've never told a white person they're more Christian than they are white.
Right.
You've never said that to a person. And even if that were true, none of this changes the fact that I'm being treated differently because of the color of my skin. This is about you not wanting to deal with any of that. And it made me feel gross for the rest of the day, but what am I going to do? I'm one of like 2 Black people on this entire trip, and the other one I'm married to. So it's like, it's a whole tension while being out in the mission field. So it's like, I'm an asset to you. It's sort of a microcosm of the way we're treated. It's like, to be Black almost anywhere in the world is to have function but not value. It's to have usefulness but not humanity. And so it's like I am basically on the par with a Phillips screwdriver. I'm useful when you're trying to put something together, but other than that, I'm just going to live in your toolbox. And that's kind of how it is when you're a person of color in these spaces. It's like, you're useful when I don't want to appear racist. You are useful when our church wants to sing Waymaker. You are useful when it's Black History Month and we need a fact. Educate us. If you acknowledge Black History Month at all, you're useful when we're going into a heavily Black community and we need somebody to talk to them. Like that's kind of what it is. So it's all about kind of learning to navigate that. And that's, you can say that's kind of true in the deconstruction space to some degree.
Yeah. I mean, I know we are going on and I want to be conscious of your time, but maybe we could talk about that and then we can kind of wrap up because I don't want to push you too long. It's also 25 to 3 in the morning here. But I love staying up. But if you notice me yawn, it is not because you're boring. It's I am
I recognize just the time
shutting
difference.
down.
No.
Yeah, and I also want to say as well, like I am learning. I am doing my best. Honestly, I'm probably not even doing my best most of the time, if I'm fully honest, because I have a bunch of mental health issues. I am a really selfish person, so I think I'm doing my best most of the time. But hey, if I ask questions that are insensitive, if I say something that you feel is in some way, shape, or form a microaggression, I would love for you to mention it to me as well. And so I just am conscious that we're talking about a lot of things that I don't think about nearly enough, and I see only from a white space, right, through a white gaze. And so I just want to be conscious of that, and please call me out if you do, if there's stuff I do say.
Hasn't happened yet, so yeah.
but let's talk about. You probably missed it. I don't know. I'm sure there was something at some point. Let's talk about deconstruction space, because this is, I mean, it's a hot topic right now. I don't know how much you've been dragged into that or not. I took a social media hiatus. I've been on top of my DMs a bit, and I only post. I've tried not to consume for probably about 6 months, because I have been going through mental health hell for about 1.5 years, and it's just not helpful for me to go through it. And I missed a lot of what's gone on in the last kind of, I think it was about November last year, a lot of different stuff in the deconstruction space. And I am really close to a lot of people that this conversation is revolving around, or at least a lot of people that are having the conversation. But I kind of, I mean, we can go down that road if you think it's helpful or important. But what I would like to do is maybe take a step back and just talk about the topic as a whole of the need for decolonization within the deconstruction space. And this is something I mentioned at the beginning. I don't know if I mentioned it before we started, but this is something I've been struggling with a lot recently. And most of my following will have noticed in the last 1.5 years, I post every day, mostly memes at this point, with a question, because I'm kind of done hearing my own voice. And I've been posting less and less and less podcasts unless I can find someone that isn't a white male to do one. I say that knowing that the last 2 podcasts I just did were with white males. But I'm getting fed up of hearing my own voice. I look on the screen as I record a podcast and I'm just like, fuck, here's another white guy talking in the space that has been dominated by white guys. And to a lesser degree by white women, and not just white women and white guys, but white women and white guys that look a certain way, that fall into a certain socioeconomic background, that are a specific look. They are usually able-bodied, whatever it is. There's so many different privileges that are generally afforded in the Christian platform that seem to have just naturally translated. And there, of course, is a dynamic where you go, most people deconstructing from evangelicalism, let's say, okay, what percentage of evangelicalism is Black people of color, etc. There's going to be naturally more white people that then have something to say. Absolutely. I think that's like a duh. We're not talking about like, that shouldn't be a shock horror to anyone. But I am in awe of how many people of color, Black, Indigenous folks that are out there doing amazing work in the space of deconstruction. And I click on their accounts and people send me their stuff and I discover them, or I'm on Explore and I somehow discover them. But that's rare. Mostly it's people send me it, and mostly it's like, hey, does anyone know of any other people that are Black, Indigenous, people of color that are doing this work? And people send me a link, and that's how I find them. And I'm in awe. They have followings of 200 people, 1,000 people. maybe if they're huge, 10,000 people, you know, they are not big accounts. And they're doing incredible work that, like for like, if they were a pretty white woman, another bearded white guy, they would have 50,000 followers, right? I mean, like, let's call it as it is. What are your thoughts as, first of all, you're a Black guy in this space, you are in this space, but also as someone, I guess, as someone that's consuming in this space as well. Like, even when you entered this space, you mentioned people, of course, you came across Joe, which is amazing, right? What an entry, because fuck, what a powerful woman of color that is just knows where she's at, knows what to talk about, calls it as it is. I mean, just I am in awe of Joe so much.
Oh, she's incredible.
But the fact that everyone, you talk about any people of color in this space, the first person they're going to talk about is Joe, because she's the biggest account in the space. I don't know anyone that has an account her size. What's that like for you? You know, what's it like for you coming into the space and going, do you feel like, oh, here's another space dominated by white people? Do you feel that? Or what's going on? And what does it feel like as you're someone that's trying to speak about these things? Do you feel you're hitting like an invisible ceiling here where you're like, fuck, man, I feel like if I was white, I would definitely get in front of more people with these topics? Or
I think there's sort of a mental acknowledgement of that fact of like, if I looked a certain way, if my skin were fair and I didn't have dreadlocks or whatever, then maybe it would get in front of more eyes. And that maybe even that the reason I've gotten in front of as many eyes as I have is because of a white person. Like I was speaking with a friend of mine 2 years ago, right when the pandemic was happening, and they were pastoring a church at the time. And this is a white person who has been doing the decolonizing work for like a decade, maybe longer. And so they are very aware, and they are like very actively teaching their kids about it. Like they're actively like talking about it and pushing the conversation and talking to white people about the problem. They're incredible. And it's good to have friends like that in these kinds of spaces. So I think mentally it was there is an acknowledgement that if I was white, then maybe there would be more traction. But there's a part of me that would like to see more. But at the same time, I'm thankful that it's getting seen at all. Like, you know, like I'm amazed that I'm getting messages about like, hey, this really helped, or seeing it get shared somewhere. It's like, oh, wow. Like that still blows my mind.
Yeah.
That the stuff's getting shared anywhere. Like, it's just wild to see, like, you know, like, oh yeah, like a friend of mine messaged me like months ago about something I posted, and I didn't think it was going to do what it did. And it was like a thing I think about all the time, but I just put it in a post. And they said, you're on like the explore page for like, if you hit deconstruction, like yours is one of like the first ones that comes up. And I'm like, nice. Oh, wow. And I'm not really thinking about that. It's more like this is what I'm feeling. I'm going to put this out, done. And I've been able to cultivate like a really small kind of thing that's kind of quirky. And I recognize that my thing is kind of strange because I'm not always talking about deconstruction. Like, so sometimes I'm talking about deconstruction. Sometimes I'm talking about racism. Sometimes I'm down some really weird, obscure music nerd rabbit hole, where like I'll play these games where like the titles of some of my posts are song lyrics. Do you know what they are? Like having fun with it.
Right. That's where you lose me, because I'm like, so it's not a muso at all.
The same thing. So there may be a lot of reasons outside of like, say, racism, like that would affect why my attraction is where it is.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense for sure.
Yeah.
And I also want to say, you know, like you are making a huge, I mean, you've really helped me in so many ways. And I get people sending me your stuff going, this guy's great. Do you know him? Can you have him on your podcast? So like, I in no way want to say that,
that's crazy.
People in this space that are BIPOC, you know, like they're not, it's not that they're not making these huge impact, but to me, what it is I'm just like, Jesus, these people are better than me and I've got a bigger following. Or like, how the hell is that person? Like, I mean, they're, yes, okay. But like, I mean, like, how is this person not getting more traction? Like, I think to me that frustrates me. And And I think as well, you know, one of the big topics that came up in November, where a lot of this conversation came up over a picture that was very white and very specific.
Yeah.
There's a dynamic of being seen that, you know, most people are used to not seeing themselves on the stage, because let's be honest, most of us aren't perfectly fucking photoshopped humans, right? And especially after COVID, I don't know about you. And we're not all white, we're not all able-bodied, we're not all whatever, right? And there is a dynamic of that being seen. And I'm so conscious of, being a part of, for me, I'm conscious of, am I being a part of alienating more people on some level? But what was that like for you coming into the space? Did you feel like, did you feel like, gosh, this is a white space? Like, what is my place here? Is this going to be more of the same? Did you go through those thoughts at all, or not really? Did that not really cross you? Were you just so happy to find people that kind of thought similar things?
Yeah, that's kind of what it was. Like, I was like, first of all, people are actually paying attention. Like, that's new. Secondly, like, a lot of the conversations I got to have in the wake of the things that were posted were so productive that, you know, it was like, what is value to me? Like, you have to answer that question of like, what do I find valuable? Is it about having 10,000 people who will treat what you're saying like Starbucks, like consume it and then toss it? Or is it better to have, I think I have like 2,200 followers, something like that. Is it better to have less people who are more invested in what you're saying and will actually put stuff into place? You know, and I don't know what the answer to that is, but the thing is that the conversations I was having are with people who seem genuinely interested, or people who have genuine questions, not a like, hey, Black man, educate us thing. It's like, I genuinely don't understand this. And you can always tell what's up with those types of things. So when that happens and somebody asks that question, it's like, yeah, I got time for you. Let's go. Because you actually want to learn so you can put it in place. And I can see that because I'm seeing what you're doing. So because those conversations were so great, and there were a lot of people who get it and who, number one, don't expect you to be the be all end all of their education, but also will reshare your stuff and say, hey, support this person, you know, or support these Black creators, whether or not there's an event happening at all. And I see that happen a lot. There have been so many people and so many accounts that have been so supportive of me and things I've been saying. I think about like Blair from Talk Purity to me, who's been like someone I've talked to on occasion. Kayla from Because She Dared, Rebecca in Writing. There's so many. Janice from God Is Not Given. I did a podcast with her like 6 months ago. She's the best. Like, it's just,
she is a legend. I've got another podcast scheduled with her in a couple of weeks. I'm so excited.
She's the best.
Oh,
but like all these people, and then that's the other thing too, finding other people of color in this space was like kind of a revelation, because, but also an education in some ways. Because in the case of like Rebecca in Writing, who was born in India, and so she probably has a way different perspective on things than I would, even though we have like, it's one of those things where you realize that similarities and sameness are not the same thing. So it's like, we don't have the same experience, but we have similar ones. So she can speak to certain things that I can't. And so it's an education every time she talks, because it's coming from that place, you know, which is why what happened in November for me is kind of a weird place, because it's like, as a man, it's hard for me to really be someone who's like speaking super vocally about this, because this was about women. This was an issue that uniquely centered women of color. And in particular, it highlighted ways in which women of color are treated poorly individually within their own spaces. So like, as Joe has spoken about what's happened to her, I think about like somehow some of the posts that happened in the wake dragged Black women into it unnecessarily.
It was
when
horrendous.
Black women were not involved at all. And, you know, Janice was one of the people who spoke to that. So for me, even though I'm a person of color, I'm not a woman. So that's an opportunity for me to sit back and say, okay, y'all need to have this, because women of color, like as bad as men of color get it, women of color get it even worse. So I'm like, you know what, like I need to sit back and acknowledge my privilege here and say, like, you know, this is for me to listen and to support y'all's voices.
Yeah.
And say, okay, Rebecca is talking, here you go. Janice is talking, here you go. Joe is talking, here you go. My function in all of that was more so like talking to other people about it, and then other people were asking me questions about what happened because they didn't know what was going on. And it was so the last couple of weeks I was kind of like a weird like point person, and I wasn't trying to insert myself in that at all, but it was just kind of where I was. And I was thankful to function in that role, because on some very, very minuscule level I was able to keep some of the heat off. So that way it wasn't like Rebecca having to respond to everything or Joe having to respond to everything. And I'm sure they probably had to respond to a lot of things, but it was cool to be somebody who could talk to somebody. So that way that's one less person that talked to them, impacts them mentally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's such, it's such a bizarre, so I'm still catching up. I spent last kind of week kind of like reading through, trying to catch up on everything. And I got lots of DMs about it. And I just wasn't in the space over like Christmas, New Year. I just was like, I am putting out fires every day. I don't know what's going on right now. I'll look into it later. No comment. Sure. I just don't know. But you know what? All I'll say is I 100% side with those that feel marginalized, unseen, you know, whatever the deal is there. That's a voice we should listen to and 100%. Understand why we have hurt someone, whatever the deal is. Right.
Yeah.
And that goes, and now I've looked into it. I'm like, well, even more so, I'm like, oh my God, like, why can we not just listen and go, oh yeah, let me take that feedback on, you know, I'm not saying any intent or whatever, you know, like, gosh, like just listen. And I'm good friends with a lot of these people as well. And you know, I'd say the same to them. And I have said so. But for me, I'm like, I'm a white guy here. And part of me goes, this is not my space to talk at all. Part of me goes, maybe I should be using my platform to speak and say, well, here I am siding with someone, or this is what I see. Like, it's such a horrible place to know how to use a platform. And I say horrible, I mean, God, this is privilege, right? So I know that. I'm not saying like, woe is me. I'm just saying this is the internal monologue in my head of going, how do I do this without being the don't worry everyone, white guy coming to rescue us? Because fuck me, I have no solutions here, and I shouldn't have solutions, and it's not my place to have solutions.
Right, exactly.
But it's like so I'm having like Janice on, and I'm hopefully gonna grab Joe Lumen again, and actually Rebecca. Yeah. So like different people, I'm hoping to have on the podcast upcoming, so that I can go, hey, let me at least try and get their conversation in front of more people or something. But even that, it feels like this weird thing where it's like, here, let me give you my platform. I don't know, there's this weird thing in me where I'm going, am I being the good guy or the bad guy here? Like, and is it as black and white as that, right? I don't know if it is. Right. And it's a weird one to balance. So yeah, I mean, I there's a similarity there, right? So as men, we have a similarity there.
Yes.
It rapidly falls apart after that, right? I mean, I know no knowledge of what it's like. But yeah, it's a weird, and I'm coming in so late as well. So it seems even weirder for me to be like, hi, let me have this conversation. Like, fuck, I don't know. But what I do know is I want to talk to these people anyway. And I love talking to people anyway, whatever it looks like. But yeah, it's a weird one. It's a weird, it's just weird, this space. I'm just so conscious of how wide it is. And I love chatting with people, but God, I'm like, every other person is bloody, like not every other person, every person is white. Like, I'm like, Jesus Christ. I'm like looking through a sea of white people. My inbox is full of people going, hey, I wrote a book. Will you have me on your podcast? I'm like, Jesus, no, I have no interest at all. And anyone that sends me a message that says, can you be on my podcast? But you know what? I'll be honest, if someone sent me a message saying, hey, I wrote a book, can I be on your podcast? And they were black, I'd be like, fuck yes. Because there's hardly anybody out there that is on my radar that I'm not just going, I'm going to have this person back on. It's a really it's just a weird space that is so white. And the I think the what happened in November was inevitable. I think that was something that was going to happen one way or another. We were looking at platforms being built. I think Janice's, you mentioned Janice's stuff. Janice's blog that she wrote on this was absolutely perfection. It was just absolutely fucking on point. So if you haven't read that, I can't remember what it's called, but I really recommend it. I'll actually put a link to it in the show note. I hope that doesn't overshadow you too much. I'll put a link to all your stuff as well.
Please
but people
do.
should go read this article. It was so good.
So good.
But it talks to the topic of platforming and platform culture. And I think there is a level of entitlement with whiteness where a platform is almost presumed or assumed or expected.
Right.
And yeah, I just think it's a really complex thing. And so yeah, I'm just so intrigued by what your thoughts are on those different dynamics. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it's tough. It's tough to kind of figure out how much of yourself should be involved and how much should be removed, and just to know like am I being an ally here, or am I centering myself? And so the whole time it was just kind of dicey for me, because I want to be supportive, but I'm not entirely sure what supportive means right now. Like, so when I was kind of doing that, when I was talking to a lot of different people and whatever, it was interesting because Janice actually hit me up and she's like, hey, so I know you kind of became like an impromptu point person for this. How you doing? And I'm like, and I kind of felt bad because I was like, I was on my way to message you,
right,
to see how you were doing. like I'm trying to run interference out here, like, and not run interference, but like almost like I'm almost trying to be supportive where I can.
Right.
And it's like it's weird because that becomes a patriarchal thing where it's like, I'm supposed to look in on you, you're not supposed to, like that's, and so you're trying to figure that part out too. And so for me, it was just it was a weird thing. But as of now, no one has said that I've violated any boundaries, and I trust that they would say so if they felt that way. So I'm like, okay, so maybe I didn't completely screw this up. Maybe I was removed enough, because like nobody mentioned me, and I'm like, perfect, because I wasn't big enough part of any of this to really even be mentioned. And like, I was just talking to a couple of folks to help kind of keep the space clear for two people, one of whom has a platform that's several times the size of mine. So the effect that I'm going to have is relatively small, but hopefully it contributes to the overall. Like, that's all you can really hope for there. You're not really looking to make anything happen off of that. You're just trying to do what you can and support the people and speak up when they say they need people to speak up. Because that's not always, sometimes shutting up is the thing. But when they say, hey, we need more accounts to speak up, then okay, done.
Yeah. I think, it's helpful. And that's kind of how I've, in more recent months, years, that's kind of been my place to go, hey, I'm here. I am not here for you to teach me how to do this necessarily, ever, really. But I always welcome any teaching. But I am here to say, if you need me, give me a shout. If there's something I can do in this space to help, please. But other than that, like, I just want to do whatever that looks like to be an ally. I'm not even going to call myself an ally. I have no idea if I'm an ally. Like, I'll let other people decide that.
It's not for me to decide. Yeah, exactly.
But it's a fascinating dynamic, because I'm so aware that I have grown up my entire life never even thinking about shit like this. Never. And it's a bizarre thing to sit back and I don't know if you've seen that comedy sketch where the two German soldiers are in the trenches in the war, and they're looking at each other's caps, and they've got skull and crossbones on the caps or whatever, and they're like, have you ever noticed our caps is skull and cross? Like, are we the baddies, or whatever, right? And it is that moment, like, I joked about earlier, am I the baddie? Am I in this huge white nationalist church? And fuck, how did I get here? And I didn't think I'm racist, but fuck, there's probably some racism. And just tasting that, God, over a decade ago, and still not really working on it until maybe 2-3 years ago, really going, shit, I'm racist. I need to get doing some anti-racist work, or it's not going to change.
Right.
But it's those moments of going, fuck, I might be the baddie here still, and I need to do some work. I need to ask some questions. I need to look at that. And I really am in awe of people like yourself who have been so intentional about educating and being so open to a predominantly white space, to talk about these things, to talk about racism, to talk about deconstruction, and talk about the intersection of those two things as well. Plenty. I think, as much as it's not the space of the white person to go to a black person to be educated, at some point along that list, white people don't teach about this until they've been educated by a black person, until an indigenous person has told them their experience, right? Until someone from India talks about what it was like to grow up in the US. Like, at somewhere along that line, it takes an injection from someone. And I see the work that you're doing there, and I just think it's really amazing. And I know that you're like, it's just natural. You love teaching, you love educating, you love doing a lot of that. But I imagine it takes its toll. It's tiring, it's hard work. And so thank you. And you are a person that I continue to think, God, I wish more people would connect you. So we'll keep plugging you. And hopefully this podcast, God, guys, if you've listened to like 3 hours of us rambling about some amazing stuff, but gosh, it's 3 hours, right? I mean, if they're still here and you don't follow Benjamin, you're just a dick, right? I mean, get on it. Like, come on. Like, I don't even know.
I didn't say that. He said
no, I'm still going to say it. You're a dick if you don't follow Benjamin at this point, right? You can unfollow him if you think, it's not for me, but like, I mean, come on, give it a shot. But no, I think we should wrap up, because I mean, I could go another 3 hours too. This has been fun. It's been so insightful, educational. You've got such a fascinating story as well, and such a unique kind of background in your own experience, that it's so helpful for people to hear from different people with different experiences, that the similarities are there. I think that's the beautiful thing as well in something like deconstruction, is it crosses so many divides where we can all know. I mean, the similarity there of losing certainty and faith, that's a heavy thing to be bonding over. That's some blood runs deep through losing faith, or massively overhauling your faith. And if that can draw us together and make us look at some of the other things where we just are not the same, that's a beautiful and wonderful thing. And so, anyway, thank you. If people want to connect with you, what's the best way to do that? You're on Instagram.
I am on Instagram. I'm also on Twitter, but Instagram is at Hey There Benji, and then Twitter is at _Hey There Benji. I'm just starting to kind of venture over there a little bit.
I try doing Twitter like every year, and I do it for like a day, and I'm like, fuck, that's too much work, and I just quit.
It's like a fever dream.
Every year you'll see like 3 posts from me, and I'm like, hey everyone, I'm back, and I'll drop like something funny that I thought up that made me think I should go on Twitter, and I just disappear.
But Instagram is usually where I'm at most of the time. I post sort of often. I was working on projects this week, so I didn't get to post as much as I typically do, but I post sort of often. I'm in my stories almost every day. And it's a lot of fun.
We'll make sure links are there, and musically, right? You've got different projects and stuff, or can people follow you through that, or what is it you're doing musically?
So musically, that's coming. That's part of one of the projects I'm actually working on, is music that it's like stuff that I haven't gotten to do really in about 9 years. Wow. And because the interesting thing is that so many of my musical projects were wrapped up in church stuff, that it's kind of weird now to be doing stuff that's completely different. So I've been working on a lot of that. I'm hoping to have it done soon. Nice. So again, I'll be announcing that probably through Instagram and probably Twitter.
Yeah,
But
yeah, definitely. Let me know. Give me a tag, and I'll definitely share that for sure as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
music is not my thing. People laugh at me because I literally don't listen to music. Like I just don't particularly care about music, which is, I know I am like dead inside or something. But I understand how important it is to so many people, and can help them in so many different ways through some of the deepest, richest parts of life. And so, yeah, we'll definitely get that enhance the people.
Oh yeah,
as well.
absolutely.
Benji, man, thank you. And thank your wife for giving you 3 hours to kind of ramble on to someone in the UK. It's been honestly a joy, and I've been looking forward to meeting you, face to face as much as this is face to face for a while. And so it's been a real joy.
Same
thank
here.
you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. All right. Love you, man. Catch you later. Yeah.
All right. Take it easy.
Peace. If you are deconstructing, there is no reason to do this alone. It can be an incredibly lonely process, but the deconstructionnetwork.com is a free resource to help you find others deconstructing in your local area. If you would like to support what I do, everything I do is for free, from talking to people for hours on end to producing resources and podcasts. It is only possible because people give generously. There's never any need to give. It will always be free, everything I do. But if you do, we do have an amazing private community group that we talk on over on Discord that you would gain access to. And we do regular audio and video chats on there as well. So it'd be great to see you in there. But of course, never any requirement. And of course, please, please, please come and talk to me on Instagram. I love connecting with people. I love helping people on their journey. If you need a safe space to process your deconstruction, I would love to connect. It's just at Phil Drysdale. Love every one of you. Peace.